the man who knew too much about them in Los Angeles. By the time the second voicemail arrived, the family had already stopped answering unknown numbers. The first one had been strange enough. A man with a low, even voice had asked whether the hallway light had been fixed yet and whether the child was still afraid of the sound the pipes made after midnight. He spoke as if he had lived in the apartment with them, as if he knew the small, private discomforts that never left the walls. On the second message, he mentioned a broken dish that had not fallen yet and a visit from police that had not happened. He ended both calls the same way, with a pause so long it sounded like listening, and then a soft, almost thoughtful good night. The reports that later circulated in Los Angeles were always incomplete in the same frustrating way. They described a pattern without ever quite finding its center. According to people who spoke to investigators, the calls did not begin with threats, they began with knowledge. The caller knew which bedroom window stuck in humid weather. He knew which relative had recently moved away. He knew that one tenant kept a coffee mug by the sink with a hairline crack running through the handle. He knew what time the dog in the neighboring unit usually started scratching at the front door. These were not facts anyone would place online. They were not dramatic enough to be shared and too small to seem important until a stranger began saying them aloud. The family at the center of the case, or at least the family most often mentioned when the story is retold, had moved into an aging apartment building on a side street west of downtown. It was the sort of place that always looked tired even in full sun. The lobby smelled faintly of bleach, old paper, and rainwater trapped in concrete. The mailboxes rattled when buses passed. At night, the corridors took on that strange apartment stillness, where every tiny sound seemed to travel too far. Footsteps on another floor could seem close enough to belong to someone standing just outside the door. They were ordinary in the way many people become ordinary inside stories like this. A couple, a young child, a grandmother who stayed with them off and on, a narrow living room, secondhand furniture, a television that gave off a dull electric warmth long after it had been switched off. Neighbors later said they kept to themselves. Nothing about them invited attention. That, in some quiet way, made the case worse. The first events that unsettled them could still be explained. A package moved from the front mat to the windowsill, a kitchen cabinet left open, the grandmother insisting she had heard someone speak in the hall outside at 3 o'clock in the morning, though no footsteps followed. Then came the phone calls. Sometimes the man called late in the evening, sometimes near dawn. Once, according to one account, the phone rang just after the child woke, crying from a dream, and the caller asked whether the nightmare had been about the red water again. No one in the apartment had spoken about that dream outside the home. After that, fear settled in by degrees. It did not arrive all at once. It thickened the air instead. The couple checked locks twice, then 3 times. They closed the blinds before sunset. They lowered their voices without quite knowing why. The grandmother began covering the peephole with a folded square of tissue, saying she did not like the feeling of an eye meeting hers through it. In daylight, the apartment remained ordinary. Laundry piled in corners, sunlight crossed the floor in long, pale bars. The refrigerator hummed, the child watched cartoons, someone boiled water for tea. But each evening, as the building darkened and the corridor outside flattened into shadow, the rooms seemed to draw inward. Then the caller mentioned the woman from downstairs. He asked whether she had stopped by yet to complain about the leak. At that point, no one from downstairs had come up, there had been no complaint, the ceiling below was still dry. The family listened to the message twice, then a third time, standing in the kitchen with the overhead light buzzing faintly above them. The grandmother turned toward the ceiling as if she could hear water gathering inside it. The next afternoon, the downstairs tenant knocked on the door with a hard, irritated look and said there was a stain spreading above her bathroom mirror. The police were contacted not long after that, though exactly when depends on whose version is being told. Some say officers came after the voicemail about the leak. Some say the family waited until the caller described the child's school backpack, including the fading cartoon patch stitched near the zipper. Either way, the first formal response appears to have been cautious. Harassing calls, possible stalking, nothing yet that could be pinned to a face. The officers asked practical questions in calm voices. Had anyone recently been in the apartment for repairs? Had there been arguments with neighbors? Had the family given out personal information? They took notes beside the front window while afternoon traffic drifted outside in a long metallic hush. Then they left, promising follow-up. That night, another message appeared. The same voice said the officers had forgotten a pen on the radiator cover, and he was right. He also said one of them would come back alone because he had left part of his report unfinished. According to the family, the apartment seemed to go still around those words. The refrigerator stopped humming. The pipes made a sound like a throat being cleared deep inside the wall. The child, who had been playing on the floor, looked up without speaking. Less than an hour later, there was a knock at the door, and one of the officers stood outside, apologetic, asking if he had left his pen. Stories like this often grow around their own emptiness. Where facts end, rumor begins laying down its thin, cold layers. Some later believed the caller must have been watching from inside the building. Others suspected an employee, a former tenant, someone who knew how sound moved through the place, and where vents carried conversation. There were quieter theories too. A maintenance worker with keys, a neighbor nobody noticed, someone who had become obsessed not with harming the family at first, but with proving that privacy in a city could be peeled away one detail at a time. Yet the part that remained hardest to explain was not how he knew the present, it was how he seemed to know what came next. He spoke of small things first, the kind of things that could be called lucky guesses if taken one by one. He said the grandmother would cut her thumb on a can lid. She did. He mentioned that the child would lose a tooth at school and come home frightened by the blood. That happened too. He said a framed picture near the television would fall during the night, and before morning, the glass would be broken across the rug in glittering pieces. The family moved the frame into a drawer after hearing that message, but another picture, one no one had thought about, slipped from a shelf after midnight and shattered in the dark. With each correct detail, the apartment changed. It became less like shelter and more like a place already known to someone else. They stopped discussing plans inside it. They took walks just to talk privately, though even then they lowered their voices when passing parked cars. The child began sleeping in the living room with the television on low, not watching it, only needing the murmur of people who were not there. The grandmother insisted that whoever was doing this had been inside before because some knowledge could not be gathered from windows or walls alone. She said there was a difference between being watched and being remembered. Investigators, according to later accounts, tried tracing the calls. Some were routed through services that obscured origin, others ended too quickly. One call appeared to come from a public phone that no longer existed by the time officers checked. Another was linked to a convenience store where no clerk remembered the man who used it. These details, repeated over the years, gave the case its urban legend shape. Los Angeles is full of places where one person can vanish into the machinery of the city. Light, traffic, distance, apartment blocks stacked close as filing cabinets, every face passing a bus stop can look temporary. The family prepared to leave. That much seems consistent across versions. Boxes appeared in the apartment, clothes were folded and refolded, important papers disappeared into a single taped envelope. They told almost no one. The plan, if it can be called that, was to go quietly and break whatever chain had bound this man to them. The grandmother wrapped dishes in newspaper at the dining table while dusk pooled in the corners of the room. The child asked whether the new place would have the same pipes. No one answered. On the final night in the apartment, the voicemail arrived before sunset. It was shorter than the others. The man said there was no point packing the blue suitcase first because the zipper would fail again. He said they should keep the medicine in reach because the grandmother would feel faint on the stairs. Then, after a pause, he said something that was remembered differently by different people, but all versions share the same shape. He referred to a knock at the door that would come later and warned them not to open it until the third knock. There had never been a pattern of 3 knocks. Darkness gathered slowly outside the windows. The building seemed unusually quiet, as if other residents had stepped out of it all at once. The grandmother sat with one hand over the packed envelope of documents. The couple checked the locks. The child slept early on a folded blanket, face turned toward the television glow. Now and then, a car passed below and cast moving bands of light across the ceiling. The blue suitcase, left open near the bedroom door, had indeed snagged at the zipper. Nobody said that aloud. At some point after midnight, someone knocked. Once, the sound was soft, almost polite. Every person in the apartment heard it. The grandmother looked toward the door without moving. The second knock came after a long pause, louder this time, enough to wake the child. The mother held him close. The father stood in the narrow hallway between living room and door, not approaching, just listening. Outside, there were no footsteps, no voice, no rattle of keys. Only the old building holding its breath around them. The third knock never came. Instead, the phone rang. Not the mobile phone, the apartment phone, the old one near the kitchen wall that had carried most of the calls. Its ring cut through the silence with a flat mechanical force that made the child cry out. No one moved to answer it at first. It rang and rang, each burst seeming louder than the last, until finally the father crossed the room and lifted the receiver with a hand that later would not stop shaking. At first, there was only breathing. Then, the familiar voice said, very gently, that he had told them not to open the door until the third knock, and that now it was too late anyway because the person outside had gone. The father asked who it was. The caller did not answer. Instead, he asked whether the officer had come back yet. There was no officer expected that night. According to the most repeated version, there came then a new sound from the corridor, distant but distinct, as if someone at the far end had begun walking toward the apartment with measured steps, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, unbroken movement over old hallway flooring. The father stood frozen with the receiver to his ear. The breathing on the line matched nothing and explained nothing. The grandmother began whispering under her breath in a language the child did not understand. The footsteps came closer, then stopped directly outside the door. This time there was no knock. Something brushed the metal of the knob once, lightly, like fingertips testing temperature. Then silence. The caller remained on the line for several more seconds. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed in a way no one later described the same way. Some said it sounded pleased, some said it sounded disappointed. One account says it sounded farther away, almost hollow, as though he had stepped into a larger room. He said only that they should leave before morning, because after morning it would become difficult to tell who had been inside. The line went dead. They left before dawn. That part is treated as fact. Bags, child, documents, blue suitcase with the bad zipper. They went down the stairwell because no one trusted the elevator. On the landing between floors, the grandmother did become faint. The envelope of papers slipped from her lap and scattered. One sheet drifted against the railing and hung there for a moment before dropping into the dim shaft below. The father later said he had the strange certainty, while gathering them, that someone on the floor beneath was standing perfectly still and looking up through the central opening of the stairs. When he forced himself to look, he saw only darkness in the pale rectangle of a lower hallway. After they left, the case thinned. New address, changed numbers, fewer public details. Publicly discussed incidents like this do not always end with arrests or explanations. Sometimes they end with distance, with silence, with a family deciding that survival is enough and clarity is not owed to anyone. There were said to be no further calls for a while. Then there were rumors of one more, months later, to a phone number almost no one had. In that final message, the caller reportedly asked whether the child still remembered the hallway with no third knock. That part has never been confirmed. What remained in local retellings was the apartment itself. Tenants came and went, managers changed, paint went over old scuffs, carpets were replaced. Still, people in the building are said to have talked about the family who moved out before sunrise and never returned for the rest of their things. A neighbor claimed a box of kitchenware stayed in the manager's office for weeks. Another said the unit was empty longer than it should have been and that maintenance workers disliked entering after dark. Someone else insisted the old phone jack in the kitchen was removed because it kept picking up dead air. The most unsettling detail survives in the smallest form. According to one version of the story, investigators reviewing notes from the early calls found that the man had mentioned a minor event no one recognized at the time. He said that before everything ended, one of them would look back from the stairwell and think they saw a person standing inside the apartment they had just locked. Not at the door, farther in, near the living room window where the evening light used to fall. Only later did the father remember that moment. He had looked back once while carrying the blue suitcase. He had seen, through the narrow opening before the door latched, what seemed to be a figure already inside the room, motionless and waiting in the dimness. He convinced himself it had been a coat hanging from a chair. That is what he told himself then, that is what he told police later. But years afterward, when the story had become a half-whispered Los Angeles cautionary tale and the details had begun to blur at the edges, the one thing he reportedly remained certain about was this: the figure had not been near the chair. The child's drawing found inside the wall. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to old houses. It is not the empty, hollow quiet of a newly constructed building, nor the peaceful stillness of an open field. It is a heavy, settled silence. It is the sound of a structure that has spent decades absorbing the lives, the whispers, and the breathing of those who walked its halls, only to be left entirely alone. The dust settles over the hardwood floors like a shroud, and the shadows stretch out from the corners, uninterrupted by the warmth of human presence. When someone finally returns to wake the house from its slumber, the air shifts. It resists. According to those who make a living restoring forgotten properties, an old house never likes having its bones exposed. In the autumn of 1996, a couple named Arthur and Eleanor purchased a Victorian farmhouse on the rural, forested edge of a small valley in the Pacific Northwest. The property had been built in 1891 by a local lumber mill owner, a man whose family had long since moved away or passed on. For more than 3 decades, the tall, asymmetrical house had sat completely vacant. The surrounding woods had slowly crept closer to the property line, with the dark, heavy branches of ancient Douglas firs casting long, jagged shadows across the peeling paint of the front porch. The couple, seeking a quiet life far from the noise of the city, intended to restore the house entirely by hand. They knew it would be slow, grueling work. They did not know what was waiting for them in the dark, sealed spaces between the rooms. The first month of renovations was entirely consumed by demolition. The house smelled strongly of damp earth, dry rot, and old chimney soot. The days grew shorter, and the cold November rains arrived, drumming a continuous, monotonous rhythm against the slate roof. Arthur and Eleanor worked primarily by the harsh, yellow glow of halogen work lights, peeling away layer after layer of floral wallpaper that had become fused to the walls by decades of moisture. They hired a local carpenter, a quiet man named Thomas, to assist with these structural repairs. Thomas rarely spoke, preferring to work in the dim corridors with his head down. But as the weeks passed, Eleanor noticed that Thomas would frequently stop what he was doing and just listen. He would stand perfectly still in the center of a room, his eyes fixed on the ceiling or the heavy oak doors, as if trying to locate the source of a faint, distant sound. When asked, he would merely shake his head and return to his tools. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late November that the house finally offered up its secret. Arthur was working on the second floor, tearing out a section of damaged lath and plaster in the long hallway outside the master bedroom. The air was thick with gray dust, catching the light in slow, swirling eddies. As he pulled away a particularly stubborn sheet of plaster, his pry bar slipped into a deep, hollow cavity behind the wall. The space had been entirely boarded up, intentionally sealed off from the rest of the hallway at some point in the distant past. Arthur shone his flashlight into the narrow, dark gap. Nestled between 2 thick wooden studs resting on a bed of dry, crumbled insulation was a rusted metal biscuit tin. The tin was wrapped tightly in a piece of heavy, dark oilcloth tied with a brittle piece of twine. Arthur called Eleanor up from the ground floor, and together, with the rain lashing against the narrow hallway window, they carefully untied the knot. The oilcloth smelled of mildew and stale air. The lid of the tin was rusted shut, requiring the edge of a flathead screwdriver to pry it open. Inside, there was no jewelry, no forgotten money, and no historical documents. There was only a stack of thick, yellowed paper, roughly torn at the edges, resting alongside 3 nubs of dark wax crayon. The couple carefully lifted the fragile pages from the tin, laying them out on the floorboards beneath the halogen light. There were 5 drawings in total. They appeared to be the work of a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, judging by the crude, aggressive strokes of the wax crayon. The first drawing depicted the farmhouse itself, standing against a backdrop of tall, scribbled trees. It was a standard, childlike rendering, though there was something slightly unsettling about the sheer amount of black crayon used to color the windows. Every pane of glass was filled with deep, impenetrable darkness. The second drawing showed a family, a tall man, a woman, and a small child standing in a row. However, their faces had been heavily scratched out, leaving only dark, chaotic smudges where their eyes and mouths should have been. It was strange, Eleanor thought, but not entirely unnatural for a child left alone in an isolated house to draw grim pictures. It was the third drawing that caused the first true chill to settle over the couple. The image depicted the grand parlor on the ground floor of the house. The details were remarkably specific. It showed the grand fireplace with its unique carved mantel and the large bay window looking out onto the front porch. But it also showed a very specific piece of furniture sitting in the center of the room. It was a long, green velvet sofa with curved wooden legs. It was Eleanor's sofa, an antique they had brought with them from their previous home, a piece of furniture that had never been in this farmhouse until they moved in a month ago. In the drawing, the sofa was rendered perfectly, right down to the patterned throw pillows. And standing directly behind the sofa, drawn in thick, heavy charcoal, was a tall, impossibly thin shadow, its long arms stretching down to the floorboards. Arthur stared at the paper, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. He suggested that it was merely a coincidence. Perhaps the previous owners had possessed a similar piece of furniture, perhaps it was a standard Victorian design, but Eleanor could not shake the feeling of profound unease that washed over her. She recognized the pattern on the pillows, she recognized the exact placement of the sofa in relation to the fireplace. The drawing was not a memory of the house's past, it appeared to be a reflection of its present. The fourth drawing was even more difficult to explain. It depicted the exact hallway they were currently standing in. The drawing showed the walls torn open, the exposed wooden studs, and the scattered debris on the floor. It showed a yellow light source, exactly like the halogen lamp currently shining down on them. And it showed a man, drawn with brown hair and a heavy coat, reaching his hand into the wall. It was a perfect, crude illustration of Arthur discovering the tin, but what made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat was the detail in the background. In the drawing, standing at the far end of the darkened hallway, just beyond the reach of the yellow light, was the same tall, thin shadow. It was watching the man at the wall. Arthur immediately stood up and swept his flashlight down the length of the hallway. The beam cut through the floating plaster dust, illuminating the peeling doors and the empty expanse of the corridor. There was nothing there, just the quiet, empty house and the sound of the rain. He tried to laugh it off, suggesting that Thomas, the carpenter, had played an elaborate, cruel prank on them. He argued that Thomas must have found the tin earlier, drawn the pictures himself, and placed them back in the wall for them to find. It was the only logical explanation. But when Thomas arrived the next morning, Arthur confronted him with the drawings. The carpenter looked at the papers, his face draining of color. He swore with a tremor in his voice that he had never seen them before. He refused to work on the second floor for the rest of the day, and by the end of the week, he gathered his tools, walked to his truck, and never returned to the property. The final drawing remained face down on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Eleanor refused to look at it. She felt a growing, creeping dread wrapping itself around the house. The air inside the rooms felt thicker, harder to breathe. The silence seemed to ring in her ears. At night, as they lay in the master bedroom, she would listen to the wind moving through the ancient fir trees outside, convinced she could hear the subtle, rhythmic creak of the floorboards in the hallway. Arthur, desperate to prove that the entire situation was nothing more than a misunderstanding or a trick of the mind, finally flipped the fifth drawing over on a cold, gray Sunday morning, The drawing showed the master bedroom. It was incredibly detailed. It showed the heavy oak bed frame they slept in. It showed the small, circular antique clock resting on Eleanor's bedside table. The hands on the drawn clock were carefully positioned to read 3:43. The window in the drawing was wide open, with blue and white streaks indicating cold air or snow blowing into the room. And leaning over the side of the bed, reaching a long, shadowy hand toward the sleeping figure on Eleanor's side, was the dark, featureless shape. According to Eleanor's later accounts, she begged Arthur to pack their things and leave the house that very day. She felt an overwhelming sense of impending doom, a primal instinct screaming at her to flee. But Arthur, anchored to his logic and his investment in the property, refused. He insisted that the drawings were just pieces of paper. They held no power. They were just scribbles left behind by a disturbed child or an unpleasant local trying to scare them away. He gathered all 5 drawings, placed them back inside the rusted tin, and threw the tin into the heavy iron wood stove in the kitchen. They watched the fire consume the oilcloth and the thick parchment, the smoke carrying away the crude charcoal lines. Arthur told her it was over. But burning a warning does not stop the event from arriving. 2 weeks passed. The tension in the house stretched to the breaking point. The couple barely spoke, jumping at the sound of settling wood or the rattle of the old pipes. Winter finally arrived in the valley. The constant rain turned into heavy, wet snow, blanketing the forest and muting the sounds of the outside world. The isolation became absolute. The road leading to the farmhouse was quickly rendered impassable, trapping them within the walls of the old lumber baron's home. It was on the night of the heaviest snowfall that the atmosphere in the house fundamentally shifted. The temperature dropped significantly, causing the old timber joints to groan and crack in the freezing air. Eleanor lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the master bedroom. Arthur was beside her, his breathing heavy and even, lost in a deep sleep. The only light in the room came from the faint, pale glow of the snow reflecting through the window and the small, luminous dial of the antique clock on her bedside table. The house was entirely, completely silent. There was no wind, no settling wood, just a profound, suffocating stillness. Eleanor turned her head slightly to look at the clock. The glowing green hands indicated that it was 3:30. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed in her ears. She told herself she was being irrational. The drawings were gone, buried in the ashes of the wood stove. She closed her eyes and tried to force herself to sleep, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It felt as though the darkness in the room was pressing down on her, heavy and electric. She opened her eyes again. The clock read 3:38. At 3:40, a sudden, sharp sound shattered the silence. It came from the hallway outside their bedroom door. It was the distinct sound of a floorboard groaning under the weight of a heavy footstep. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. She reached out and gripped Arthur's arm, shaking him gently, but he did not wake. He remained perfectly still, trapped in an unnaturally deep slumber. Another footstep, closer this time, right outside the bedroom door. The smell of the air in the room began to change. The faint scent of lavender, laundry detergent, and old wood was slowly replaced by something ancient and foul. It smelled like damp earth, wet ash, and decaying leaves. It was the scent of the space behind the walls. Eleanor pulled the heavy quilt up to her chin, her eyes locked on the closed bedroom door. The glowing hands of the clock shifted to 3:42. There was a loud, metallic snap. The latch on the large bedroom window, a heavy iron clasp that had been painted shut for decades, suddenly broke open. The window swung inward on its hinges, slamming violently against the interior wall. A blast of freezing air and swirling snow rushed into the room, sending the heavy curtains violently thrashing into the air. The sudden cold was paralyzing. Eleanor tried to scream, to shake Arthur awake, but her voice failed her. Her throat tightened in absolute terror. She looked at the clock. The second hand ticked upward, sweeping past the numbers, until the hands perfectly aligned. 3:43! And then the ticking stopped. The mechanical hum of the clock ceased entirely, leaving only the sound of the snow blowing through the open window. Eleanor slowly, reluctantly, turned her gaze away from the clock and looked toward the foot of the bed. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to detach themselves from the walls. They gathered, coalescing and stretching upward, forming a tall, impossibly thin silhouette against the pale light of the snow. It had no features, no eyes, no face. It was just a void of absolute darkness, and it was slowly leaning forward, reaching a long, shifting arm toward the side of the bed where Eleanor lay paralyzed. What happened next remains a matter of local speculation. The documented records from the county sheriff's department state only that the couple abandoned the property the following morning. When the snowplows finally cleared the rural road 3 days later, deputies arrived at the house to find the front door left wide open, the interior buried in a layer of drifting snow. All of the couple's belongings, their furniture, their clothes, and their tools were left exactly as they had been. The house was entirely empty. According to the local townspeople, Eleanor and Arthur walked for 5 miles through the freezing snow in the dead of night, never once looking back. They refused to ever speak of what occurred in the final moments of that hour, nor did they ever attempt to reclaim their possessions. The house was foreclosed on a year later, but it has never been successfully sold. It sits at the edge of the woods, slowly sinking back into the earth, holding its breath. And according to a rumor whispered among the local historical society, when the bank sent an appraiser to photograph the empty rooms, he found something resting on the kitchen counter. Resting perfectly clean and untouched amid the dust and the snow was a single, slightly charred piece of thick yellow parchment bearing the crude crayon drawing of an empty house. The room behind the wallpaper. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to abandoned houses. It is not an empty silence, but a heavy, waiting one. In the rural stretches of the American Midwest, where old farmhouses sit isolated amidst miles of flat, dormant fields, this silence can become absolute. According to local lore and a series of disturbing public reports from the early 2000s, one such house stood at the end of a long, overgrown dirt road in central Indiana. It had been built in 1914, a tall, narrow structure with steep gables and a wraparound porch that had slowly rotted into the damp soil. For nearly 17 years, the property had sat completely vacant. The previous owners had simply packed their belongings and left without a word to their scattered neighbors, allowing the bank to eventually reclaim the lonely property. The house sat locked, dark, and perfectly still, slowly surrendering to the elements. In the spring of 2015, the property was purchased at a county auction by a man named Elias. He was looking for a quiet restoration project, a place far removed from the noise of the city where he could work with his hands. When he first turned the heavy brass key in the front door, the air that met him was stale and thick, smelling of old pine, dry rot, and generations of trapped dust. The house was structurally sound, but the interior was a time capsule of neglect. Peeling paint hung from the ceilings like dead skin, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Elias decided to live in the house while he worked, setting up a simple cot and a camping stove in the downstairs living room. He spent his first week clearing away debris and opening windows to let the spring breeze chase away the stagnant air. The isolation was total. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and at night, the only sounds were the wind moving through the tall grass and the deep, settling bones of the old house. The master bedroom was located on the second floor, at the end of a long, narrow hallway. It was a large room, but it felt oddly claustrophobic. The walls were covered in a thick, dark, floral wallpaper that looked to have been hung sometime in the 1970s. The pattern was a dizzying repetition of brown and dull orange roses, faded by time and stained with water damage near the ceiling. Elias decided this room would be his first major undertaking. He planned to strip the walls down to the original plaster, repair the cracks, and bring light back into the space. He carried his tools upstairs on a quiet Tuesday morning, a spray bottle of solvent, a wide metal putty knife, and a heavy trash bag. He began in the corner nearest the window, scoring the thick paper and letting the chemicals soak into the ancient glue. The work was slow and hypnotic. Scrape, peel, drop. scrape, peel, drop. The rhythmic sound of the metal blade against the plaster filled the quiet room. As the day wore on, Elias found himself slipping into a trance, his mind emptying as he methodically removed decades of ugly history from the walls. But as he moved along the longest wall of the bedroom, the one that supposedly backed against the exterior of the house, he noticed something strange. The geometry of the room felt slightly wrong. He stopped and looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of his unease. The bedroom was rectangular, but the wall he was currently stripping seemed too thick. Based on the windows outside, there should have been more space between this room and the edge of the roofline. He brushed the thought away, attributing it to the quirky architecture of early 20th century farmhouses, and went back to his scraping. That night, Elias lay on his cot in the living room, listening to the house. Old houses always make noise at night, expanding and contracting with the drop in temperature. But around 2:30 in the morning, he heard a sound that did not fit the usual symphony of settling wood. It was a soft, muffled shifting coming from directly above him. From the master bedroom, it sounded like the deliberate slide of fabric across a wooden floor. He lay perfectly still, holding his breath, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. The sound came again, followed by a faint, rhythmic creaking. It was a slow, measured sound, like someone shifting their weight. Elias convinced himself it was a raccoon or a stray cat that had found its way into the attic, though he had found no holes in the roof. Eventually, the house fell completely silent again, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next day, Elias returned to the master bedroom. The air in the room felt different today. It was heavier, and despite the open window, there was a faint, sour smell hanging in the space, something like old copper and unwashed clothes. He ignored it, focusing on the wall. The wallpaper here was particularly stubborn, applied in multiple layers over the years. As he drove his putty knife beneath a thick seam, the blade caught on something hard. He pushed harder, and a large chunk of plaster flaked away, revealing a vertical strip of dark, rough-hewn wood. He frowned, running his hand over the exposed grain. It was the edge of a door frame. Curiosity taking over, Elias began to work faster, tearing away large strips of the floral paper with his bare hands. Dust plumed into the air, catching in the pale sunlight. Beneath the layers of paper and plaster, a shape emerged. It was a narrow, rectangular door, seamlessly built into the wall and plastered over decades ago. There was no doorknob, no visible hinges. It had been designed to disappear completely. Elias stood back, his heart beating a little faster in his chest. According to the original blueprints he had studied, there was nothing behind this wall but the exterior siding. Yet here was a door. He went downstairs and retrieved a heavy iron crowbar from his toolbox. When he returned to the bedroom, the silence felt expectant. He wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the hairline crack between the door and the frame. He threw his weight against the iron bar. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, shrieking crack of old wood and rusted nails, the door gave way. It popped outward, sending a shower of dry plaster dust cascading onto the floorboards. Elias pulled the door open. He expected the smell of a tomb. He expected the dry, choking scent of dead air, mouse droppings, and ancient dust. Instead, the draft that hit his face was shockingly warm. Elias raised his flashlight and pointed the beam into the darkness. Beyond the door was a narrow, hidden corridor, barely 3 feet wide, running the entire length of the bedroom wall. It was a void space, a blind spot in the architecture. But it was not empty. The beam of light swept over the floor and stopped. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, a cold numbness spreading down his arms. There was no dust on the floorboards. The space had been swept clean. Lying in the center of the narrow room was a dark green sleeping bag. Beside it sat a plastic gallon jug of water, still half full, with condensation clinging to the inside of the plastic. Next to the water was a crumpled fast food wrapper, its bright yellow logo clear and entirely modern, alongside a local newspaper dated exactly 4 days ago. Elias could not move. His mind violently rejected what his eyes were showing him. The house had been locked. He was miles from anyone. Yet here, hidden behind a sealed wall and a house abandoned for 17 years, was a space that someone was living in right now. He took a slow, trembling step into the hidden room, the floorboards groaning softly beneath his boots. The sour smell he had noticed earlier was overwhelmingly strong in here. It was the smell of a confined human body, the smell of someone hiding. He directed the flashlight beam to the back wall of the narrow space, the wall that backed up to the master bedroom. There, spaced out at eye level, were 3 small, perfectly round holes drilled completely through the wood and the plaster. Elias leaned in, shining his light near one of the holes. He looked through it. The view offered a perfect, unobstructed line of sight into the master bedroom. The hole was angled downward, focusing directly on the spot where Elias had been standing for the past 2 days, stripping the wallpaper. Whoever lived in this wall had been standing in the dark, less than 2 feet away from him, watching him work, watching him breathe, listening to the scrape of his putty knife. Panic finally broke through his paralysis. He spun around, his flashlight beam swinging wildly through the dark space. He realized the hidden corridor extended further toward the back of the house, leading toward the chimney breast. He moved toward it, his breathing shallow and rapid. As he passed the sleeping bag, he noticed something that made his stomach turn completely over. The top flap of the sleeping bag was folded back, and the fabric was crushed. Without thinking, Elias reached down and placed his bare hand against the green material. It was warm. Whoever was staying in the walls had not left days ago. They had not left hours ago. They had been in the sleeping bag when Elias first began prying at the door with his crowbar. They had listened to him breaking through the wood, and they had quietly slipped out the back of the hidden tunnel just moments before he opened it. Elias backed out of the room, his chest tight with terror. He stumbled into the master bedroom, dropping the crowbar with a heavy clatter. He did not bother to gather his tools. He did not stop to pack his cot or his camping stove in the living room below. He ran down the stairs, his boots thundering in the terrible silence of the house, threw open the front door, and sprinted to his truck. He locked the doors, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled with the keys in the ignition, and drove down the overgrown dirt road without looking back. According to later reports, the local county sheriff arrived at the property an hour later. 2 deputies drew their weapons and searched the entire house, clearing every room. When they reached the master bedroom, they found the open door in the wall. They found the sleeping bag, the fresh water, and the peepholes. But the occupant was gone. A thorough investigation of the hidden corridor revealed a secondary panel near the chimney that opened into a dark shaft leading all the way down to the dirt floor of the basement, where a small window had been quietly unlatched from the inside. The authorities never identified who had been living in the walls of the old farmhouse. They could not determine how long the person had been there or how they had known to claim the empty house as their own. Some investigators suspected it was simply a drifter, someone passing through who had found a clever place to hide from the elements. But local residents whispered other theories, wondering about the kind of person who chooses to live in total darkness, breathing the dust of a dead house just to watch a stranger from behind the wallpaper. Elias never returned to the property. He sold it back to the bank at a heavy loss, forever haunted by the memory of the warm fabric and the sickening realization of how quietly we can be watched in the dark. They found a tunnel under the school. Deep beneath the polished hardwood floors and brightly lit corridors of the old primary school, there was a heavy iron door that no one had opened in at least 40 years. It sat at the very back of the subterranean boiler room, half hidden behind rusted water pipes and mounds of forgotten maintenance supplies. The metal was cold to the touch, oxidized into a deep shade of burnt orange, and secured by a heavy brass padlock that had fused together with age and dampness. For generations of students and staff, the door was simply a fixture of the basement, an architectural dead end that blended into the permanent shadows. But according to local legend, the older buildings in the district were connected by a hidden network of steam tunnels built in the early 20th century and long since abandoned. No one knew for sure where the iron door led until the summer of 1998, when a private crew of contractors was hired to gut the basement. The school was completely empty. It was the middle of July, and the stifling, oppressive heat of the season pressed down on the brick exterior of the building. But down in the boiler room, the air was perpetually damp and uncomfortably cold. A crew of 3 men had been tasked with removing the outdated insulation and tearing out the ancient plumbing. Their work was slow, methodical, and accompanied only by the dull, droning hum of their portable work lights. The basement was a sprawling maze of concrete rooms, smelling faintly of heating oil, wet dust, and decay. On the morning of the 4th day, just past 10 o'clock, the foreman directed his team to clear the far wall. They hauled away decades of accumulated junk. There were broken wooden chairs, stacks of water-damaged textbooks, and heavy rolls of rotting canvas. When the iron door was finally exposed in its entirety, it seemed to absorb the light from their halogen lamps. The foreman, consulting the faded, brittle blueprints of the 1924 foundation, noticed that the space behind the wall was simply marked as solid earth. There was no door on the schematic. Driven by mild curiosity and the professional need to ensure no active pipes ran behind the wall, the foreman retrieved a pair of heavy bolt cutters from his truck. The brass padlock snapped with a sharp, echoing crack that rang violently through the quiet basement. The hinges shrieked in protest as the heavy iron was pulled outward, shedding thick flakes of rust onto the concrete floor. Beyond the threshold, there was no solid earth and no forgotten storage closet. Instead, the pale beams of their heavy flashlights revealed a narrow, arched tunnel made of dark, weeping brick. The tunnel stretched straight ahead, descending at a slight angle, disappearing into absolute blackness. A wave of stagnant, freezing air rolled out of the opening. It carried with it the unmistakable scent of wet earth, dry rot, and something else. It was something faintly metallic and sour, like unwashed skin and stale breath. The workers stood in total silence, shining their lights deep into the abyss. The air inside the tunnel felt incredibly heavy, as if the space itself resented the sudden intrusion of light. According to the men who were there that day, the silence emanating from the passage was profound, somehow swallowing the ambient noise of the boiler room entirely. Armed with heavy, military-grade flashlights, the foreman and the youngest of his workers stepped over the iron threshold. Their heavy work boots crunched softly on a thick layer of gray, powdery dust that coated the floor. The ceiling was low, forcing the men to stoop slightly as they walked. The brick walls were slick with thick condensation, and long, pale roots from the ancient oak trees above had pushed their way through the crumbling mortar, hanging like lifeless fingers from the ceiling. They walked for what felt like 200 feet, their lights sweeping back and forth, cutting through the dense, floating particles of dust that danced in the beams. The descent felt endless. The ambient temperature continued to drop with every step, chilling the sweat on the backs of their necks. It was the younger worker who noticed the first terrifying anomaly. He aimed his beam down at the floor, pausing his stride and holding his breath. The thick layer of dust beneath them was not undisturbed. Running right down the center of the tunnel, alongside their own fresh, heavy boot prints, was a faint but distinct trail. Someone had walked through this passage recently, but the prints were not made by boots or modern shoes. They were the distinct, unmistakable impressions of bare feet. The toes were elongated, the arches pressed flat, the skin seemingly grinding deep into the grime with deliberate, heavy steps. The tracks overlapped in places, heading both deeper into the tunnel and back toward the iron door, indicating a routine, repeated journey spanning years. The men stopped moving. The quiet of the tunnel seemed to close in around them, thick and suffocating. They listened, straining their ears against the dark, but there was only the slow, rhythmic dripping of water from somewhere far ahead. They continued forward, moving much slower now, the initial curiosity souring into a cold, creeping dread that settled in their stomachs. The tunnel began to widen, the arched ceiling opening up into a larger, cavernous space that sat directly beneath the center of the school, likely positioned right under the main auditorium. The beams of their flashlights hit a barrier. It was a makeshift wall, constructed from warped wooden pallets, rusted chain link fencing, and sheets of corrugated tin scavenged from unknown places. A heavy curtain made of sewn-together burlap sacks hung over a narrow gap in the center, acting as a crude doorway. The air here smelled intensely of old paper, damp cloth, and the undeniable sickening tang of human habitation. The foreman slowly reached out, his hand trembling slightly, using the heavy metal casing of his flashlight to push the burlap aside. What they saw inside the enclosure would haunt the men for the rest of their natural lives. It was not a temporary shelter, it was an established home. The subterranean room was meticulously organized, lit entirely by the harsh, sweeping beams of the workers' lights. In the far corner sat a makeshift bed constructed from 4 old wooden school desks bolted together and topped with a rotting gymnasium mat. Blankets made from discarded winter coats were neatly folded at the foot. A battered metal filing cabinet served as a pantry, its drawers filled with dozens of canned goods. Some of the cans bore faded labels dating back to the late 1970s, while others were freshly bought, their bright modern wrappers contrasting sickeningly with the decay around them. There was a small, battery-powered lantern, a plastic bucket of gray water, and a single, cracked mirror leaning against the brick. But the most disturbing element of the room, the detail that made the workers feel physically ill, was the walls. Every square inch of the brickwork had been plastered with pages torn from old textbooks, library volumes, and school directories. They were held in place by a thick, dark paste that smelled vaguely of iron and rot. And on every single page, written in tight, obsessive, microscopic handwriting, were detailed logs. The foreman stepped closer, leaning in and shining his light directly on the black ink. The writing detailed the daily routines of the school above. There were endless columns noting the exact times the morning bell rang, down to the very second. There were lists detailing the sound of specific footsteps in the hallway overhead, categorized by weight and pace. There were names of teachers, names of janitors, and deeply unsettling descriptions of private conversations overheard through the ventilation shafts. Whoever lived here had spent years, perhaps decades, sitting in the damp dark, listening to the life of the school, moving above them, recording every mundane detail with a patient, terrifying dedication. On a small wooden crate functioning as a bedside table, they found a collection of objects arranged like a shrine. There were dozens of small, seemingly insignificant items that had undoubtedly been lost by the children above over the years. A plastic hair clip, a broken yellow pencil, a single silver earring, a faded spelling test graded with red ink. These items had been meticulously cleaned and arranged in perfect, symmetrical circles. It was undeniable evidence that the inhabitant did not just stay in the tunnel. In the dead of night, when the building was locked and empty, they had been leaving their subterranean nest, walking the silent halls of the school, collecting discarded pieces of the world they were obsessed with, before retreating back into the earth before sunrise. In the exact center of the room sat a single wooden chair. It was positioned directly beneath a heavy iron grate set into the ceiling. The younger worker aimed his flashlight upward, illuminating the vertical shaft above the grate. It led straight up to a secondary floor vent, one that they knew belonged to the kindergarten classroom. A thick, icy knot formed in the foreman's stomach. Beside the chair was a small radio, entirely disassembled. Its delicate wires had been spliced and run up the wall, tapped directly into the school's public address system. The inhabitant of the tunnel had not just been listening through the floorboards, they had been wired into every single room in the building, capable of hearing every morning announcement, every lecture, every scolding, and every quiet whisper captured by an open intercom button. The workers stood paralyzed, the absolute wrongness of the space sinking deep into their bones. The realization that hundreds of children had played, teachers had taught, and administrators had worked for years, while a nameless, faceless observer existed beneath their feet, was a suffocating weight. The air felt utterly breathless. Then, from the absolute blackness of the tunnel extending past the living quarters, they heard it. It was a very soft, deliberate sound. the subtle, wet scrape of a bare heel dragging across loose stone. The sound was incredibly close, perhaps no more than 30 feet away in the pitch blackness. The beam of the younger worker's flashlight trembled violently, illuminating the floating dust, but hitting nothing but deep, shifting shadows. Another scrape echoed through the tunnel. Then, a slow, rattling exhalation of breath that bounced off the damp bricks. They did not wait to see what was standing in the dark. The men turned and ran. They abandoned their heavy tools, their boots slamming against the floor of the tunnel, kicking up massive clouds of gray dust that choked their lungs. The darkness seemed to chase them, the oppressive silence of the tunnel suddenly replaced by the frantic echoing of their own panicked flight. They scrambled up the slight incline, their beams bouncing wildly off the arch ceiling. They burst through the iron door into the relative safety of the boiler room, the foreman slamming the heavy metal shut behind them with a deafening crash. He grabbed a heavy length of industrial chain from the floor and wrapped it around the handle, securing it with a spare lock from his tool belt. They stood in the bright, artificial light of the basement, gasping for air, staring intensely at the rusted door, half expecting the handle to slowly turn. The local police were called later that afternoon. Several officers descended into the basement, armed and incredibly cautious, and cut the chain. They navigated the long, dusty tunnel and found the subterranean room exactly as the terrified workers had described. But the space was completely empty. The occupant was gone. Further exploration by investigators revealed that the tunnel continued for another mile, eventually emptying out into an overgrown, abandoned storm drain near the edge of the county line. The police collected the massive stacks of journals, the rusted cans, and the spliced radio parts, hauling them out in sealed plastic evidence bags. The contents of those pages were never released to the public, though quiet rumors persisted among local law enforcement that the meticulous handwriting matched a former night custodian who had vanished without a trace in the late 1960s. The school district acted quickly and quietly to bury the incident. Within a week, a specialized construction crew was brought in during the dead of night to pour tons of solid concrete behind the iron door, sealing the tunnel forever. The official story provided to the town and the parents was a vague statement about addressing minor structural instabilities in the ancient foundation. The workers were paid generously and moved on to other jobs in different towns. But those who stood in that underground room never truly shook the memory. They spoke in hushed tones of the damp smell, the meticulous handwriting, and the terrifying patience of a life lived entirely in the dark. The school still stands today, bustling with life and the joyful sounds of children. But sometimes, when the building is quiet and the bitter winter winds howl around the old brick exterior, teachers working late insist they can hear a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from deep within the walls, as if someone is still down there, listening and waiting. The Woman in Room 14. There is a stretch of highway in the deep southwest carved through a desolate expanse of cracked earth and dying sagebrush where the silence feels heavy enough to crush bone. It is an old road, built long before the interstate system bypassed the small desert towns, leaving them to wither and dry under the relentless sun. Along this forgotten route, miles from the nearest gas station or functioning streetlight, sits the decaying skeleton of a mid-century motor lodge. The neon sign that once drew tired travelers off the blacktop has long since shattered, its bent metal letters rusted into illegibility. Most of the guest rooms are missing their doors, their interiors exposed to the wind and the drifting sand, but according to local lore, one door always remained closed. The peeling, sun-bleached numbers nailed to the wood identified it as Room 14. For decades, long-haul truckers and lost motorists have reported pulling over to the shoulder of the highway near the ruins of the motel, seeking a few hours of sleep before continuing their journey. The isolation of the desert at 2 o'clock in the morning is profound. The only sounds are usually the ticking of a cooling car engine and the low moan of the wind pushing through the empty swimming pool. Yet, a disturbing number of those who stopped near the ruins claimed their rest was interrupted by something unnatural. They described an atmosphere that grew suddenly, stagnant, a sharp drop in the ambient temperature, and a faint electrical hum that seemed to vibrate in their teeth. And then there was the light. The motel officially closed its doors in 1992. The county cut the power lines to the property in 1994, leaving the entire structure in total darkness. Despite this documented fact, numerous witnesses over the years have sworn they saw a pale, flickering glow spilling from behind the drawn curtains of room 14. The light was often described as the sickly, blue-gray cast of an old cathode ray tube television set tuned to a dead channel. It would bleed through the cracks in the blind, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked concrete of the parking lot. Those who were brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to step out of their vehicles and approach the light reported a profound sense of wrongness that intensified with every step. The air around the far end of the motel was said to smell distinctly of stale cigarette smoke, copper, and cheap, powdery floral perfume. These scents hung in the dry desert air, completely at odds with the smell of dust and dry vegetation. Witnesses claimed that as they drew near the window of room 14, the low hum would resolve into faint, muffled sounds. Some heard the faint murmur of a one-sided conversation, spoken in a hushed, trembling tone. Others reported hearing the unmistakable sound of someone weeping softly, the sobs rhythmic and wet. The most detailed and widely circulated account came from a stranded motorist in the autumn of 2004. The man, a traveling salesman whose vehicle had broken down a mile down the road, walked toward the ruined motel in the hopes of finding shelter from the dropping nighttime temperatures. He reached the property just after midnight. He later told local authorities that the entire building looked abandoned, save for the faint blue light illuminating the window of room 14. Believing a caretaker or a fellow traveler might be inside, he walked across the glass-strewn lot and stood before the door. He raised his hand to knock, but his knuckles never touched the wood. He stated that an overwhelming feeling of dread washed over him, rooting his feet to the concrete. Instead of knocking, he leaned toward the window, peering through a narrow gap where the thick, yellowed curtain had curled away from the glass. What he described seeing has become the foundation of the legend. The interior of the room did not match the decayed exterior of the motel. According to the salesman, the room was perfectly intact, frozen in time. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling, the bed was neatly made with a patterned 1970s spread, and a heavy glass ashtray sat on the bedside table. But it was the figure in the room that caused his breath to catch in his throat. Standing perfectly still in the corner of the room, facing the wall, was a woman. She wore a faded yellow dress, the fabric looking thin and worn. Her dark hair was tangled and hung limply down her back. The witness noted that she was not transparent or spectral in any traditional sense. She looked solid, entirely real, yet terribly wrong. She did not breathe, her shoulders did not rise or fall. She simply stood in the corner, staring at the blank wood paneling, bathed in the erratic light of a television set that was not plugged into any wall. The man later recounted that he stood at the window for what felt like hours, paralyzed by a primal terror that defied logic. He wanted to look away, to run back to the highway, but his gaze was locked on the woman. Slowly, agonizingly, the woman began to turn her head. The movement was described as stiff and mechanical, like a rusted hinge being forced open. The salesman did not wait to see her face. The spell of paralysis broke, and he fled blindly into the desert, running until his lungs burned and his shoes were shredded by the rocky terrain. He was found the next morning by a passing highway patrol officer, dehydrated and incoherent, babbling about the yellow dress and the dead television. When law enforcement investigated the motel later that day, they found exactly what they expected to find. The door to room 14 was locked and warped shut by decades of weather. When they forced it open, they found an empty, ruined shell. The ceiling had partially caved in, the carpet was rotted away, and the walls were stripped to the studs. There was no wood paneling, no bed, no television, and certainly no woman. The floor was covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust. There were no footprints other than those made by the deputies themselves. This discovery did nothing to stop the stories. In fact, it only deepened the mystery. Amateur historians and local researchers began digging into the municipal archives, looking for any incident that could explain the haunting. They recovered the motel's old registry ledgers from a local historical society. The record showed that the motel had seen steady business throughout the 1960s and 70s, but the entries for room 14 stopped abruptly in the spring of 1972. For the next 20 years, until the motel finally closed its doors, the room was never rented out again. It was simply marked as out of service. There were no police reports of a murder, no obituaries matching the description of a woman in a yellow dress, and no record of a fire or accident in that specific room. The former owners of the motel had both passed away in the late 1990s, taking whatever secrets they held to their graves. The lack of a clear, tragic backstory seemed to make the phenomenon even more disturbing. It was as if the room had simply absorbed something terrible, holding on to a moment in time like a dark, psychic photograph. In the summer of 2012, another incident was documented by a group of urban explorers. 3 college students had driven out to the desert to photograph the ruins. They arrived at dusk, setting up their cameras and lights. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the desert into deep shadows, the temperature plummeted. One of the students, a young woman, wandered away from her companions to photograph the row of exterior doors. Her friends later stated they heard her drop her heavy camera gear onto the concrete. When they found her, she was standing motionless in front of room 14, staring intently at the door. She was shivering violently, her face drained of color. She claimed she had heard a woman's voice coming from the other side of the wood, whispering a sequence of numbers over and over again. When asked what the numbers were, she could not remember, stating only that the voice sounded desperate, like a warning being delivered with a crushed windpipe. The explorers packed their gear and left immediately, but the young woman claimed the smell of stale cigarette smoke and powdery perfume followed them into the car, lingering in the upholstery for weeks. She refused to ever speak of the incident again, transferring to an out-of-state university the following semester. Eventually, time and the elements took their final toll on the structure. In the winter of 2018, a severe desert storm caused the remaining roof of the motel to collapse entirely. The walls folded inward, burying the row of rooms under tons of rotting wood and shattered concrete. The county came out a few months later with bulldozers, clearing the debris and leaving nothing behind but a long, flat concrete slab baking in the sun. The door with the faded numbers was hauled away to a landfill, lost forever among the refuse. Yet, the removal of the physical building did not erase the atmosphere of the site. Drivers who pull over near the empty foundation still report a strange, heavy silence that presses against their eardrums. Occasionally, on nights when the moon is hidden and the desert is swallowed by pitch blackness, truckers on the highway report seeing a faint, blue-gray flicker hovering a few feet above the concrete slab, right where the far corner of the building used to be. Those who roll down their windows claim the dry wind still carries the scent of old floral perfume. And some swear that if you look closely into the empty darkness, just beyond the reach of the headlights, you can see the outline of a woman in a yellow dress. She is always standing perfectly still, her back turned to the road, staring into a corner that no longer exists, waiting in the silence. The face in the window above the lake. There is a specific, heavy kind of silence that settles over the deep, glacially carved lakes of northern Minnesota as autumn turns toward winter. It is a damp and suffocating quiet, one that seems to absorb the sound of the wind before it even reaches the tops of the black pine trees. Along the jagged, uneven shorelines of these remote border waters, hidden away behind thick walls of birch and rotting deadwood, sit the decaying remains of forgotten summer retreats. Most of these structures were abandoned decades ago, left to slowly surrender to the crushing weight of heavy winter snows and the creeping damp of the forest floor. They stand like hollow wooden skulls facing the dark water, their windows broken, their foundations sinking into the mud. Locals in the scattered bait shops and logging towns know better than to drift too close to these ruined properties. According to whispered rumors passed down among seasoned trappers and guides, a house left empty in the deep woods does not always remain empty. The wild, dark places have a way of claiming what is left behind, filling the empty rooms with something else entirely. In the late autumn of 1997, a solitary fisherman named Arthur sought out one of these remote, unnamed lakes. He was a quiet man who preferred the absolute isolation of the northern wilderness to the crowded reservoirs further south. Following a faded, hand-drawn map given to him by an old acquaintance, Arthur drove his rusted truck miles down a rutted logging road until the dirt path simply ended at the water's edge. He launched his small 14-foot aluminum boat into the gray water just as the sun was beginning to burn through the morning fog. The air was bitterly cold, hovering just above freezing. He started his small outboard motor, the smell of oil and exhaust mingling with the scent of dead leaves and cold pine. He navigated through a narrow, rocky channel for nearly an hour before the lake opened up into a secluded, deep-water cove. The water here was the color of black tea, dropping off sharply into a seemingly bottomless abyss just a few yards from the rocky shoreline. And there, looming over the dark water on a steep embankment, was an old two-story cabin. The structure was a monument to rot. It had been built decades earlier, perhaps in the 1950s, but the harsh northern elements had stripped away every ounce of its original warmth. The roof sagged dangerously in the center, weighed down by a thick carpet of wet, decaying pine needles. The front porch had collapsed entirely, tumbling down the embankment in a pile of splintered gray wood and rusted nails. The windows on the ground floor were shattered, leaving dark, jagged maws that breathed the cold lake air in and out. Arthur paid the ruin no mind. He was not there for the scenery. He was there because the deep water in front of the cabin was rumored to hold massive lake trout undisturbed by tourists and recreational boaters. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift silently toward the center of the cove, and dropped a heavy iron anchor into the depths. For the first 3 days, the cove was a paradise of absolute isolation. Arthur sat in his heavy wool coat, casting his line into the black water, entirely alone with the mournful calls of solitary loons. On the morning of his 4th day, Arthur arrived at the cove just as the pale dawn light began to bleed through a thick, freezing mist. The world was stripped of all color, painted in shades of charcoal and bone. As he reached into his tackle box, his eyes naturally drifted up the steep embankment toward the decaying cabin. In the upper left window of the second floor, barely visible through the grime and the creeping fog, something pale caught his attention. He paused, his hand resting on a heavy metal lure. It looked like a pale oval, perfectly still, suspended in the absolute darkness of the second-floor bedroom. Arthur narrowed his eyes, assuming it was a trick of the morning light. He figured it was a torn piece of a white curtain snagged on a stray draft, or perhaps the pale reflection of the overcast sky caught in a rare surviving pane of glass. He watched it for several long minutes. The shape did not sway, it did not shift, it simply rested there against the glass, motionless. Shaking off a sudden, irrational chill, Arthur convinced himself it was merely forgotten debris and turned his attention back to the dark, silent water. The following evening, Arthur returned for the twilight hours. The sky had bruised into deep, heavy shades of purple and black. The wind had died completely, leaving the lake's surface as smooth and reflective as a dark mirror. He anchored 60 feet from the shore, waiting in the gathering gloom. The silence of the cove was absolute, heavy enough to make his ears ring. As he sat motionless in the center of the boat, waiting for a strike on his deep water line, a profound and terrible sense of unease slowly washed over him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood rigid against his collar. He felt the distinct, undeniable sensation of being watched. Slowly, dreading what he might see, he turned his head toward the dark silhouette of the cabin. The upper left window seemed to hold a faint, unnatural luminescence in the dying light. The pale oval was there again, This time, the angle of the fading twilight revealed more detail, destroying any illusion of a curtain or a trick of the light. It was a face. It was utterly devoid of color, resembling a smooth, pale riverstone resting in the dark. There were deep, sunken depressions where eyes should be, and the heavy shape of a jaw resting against the lower pane of the window frame. It was looking down, angled directly at Arthur's small aluminum boat. Arthur sat frozen, his breath catching painfully in his throat, creating faint white plumes in the freezing air. He waited for the figure to wave, to step back into the shadows, to show any sign of living, breathing humanity. But the face remained terrifyingly rigid. The stillness was what frightened him the most. A living person shifts their weight, blinks, alters their gaze. This face was completely static, pressed against the cold glass with a horrifying, unnatural patience. Arthur did not reach for his motor, fearing the sudden, violent roar of the engine would shatter the fragile distance between them and provoke whatever was watching him. Instead, his trembling hands took up the wooden oars. He rowed backward with agonizing slowness, never taking his eyes off the second-story window until the cabin vanished into the dense shadows of the tree line. Back in the small logging town the next morning, Arthur asked the owner of a local bait and tackle shop about the property in the deep cove. The old man behind the counter stopped wiping down the cash register and went very quiet. He claimed the cabin had been locked up and entirely abandoned since the late summer of 1982. There were no roads leading to it anymore, as the old access trail had completely washed out in the severe spring floods of 1991. According to the shop owner, absolutely nobody went up there. There was no electricity, no running water, and no heat source inside the decaying shell. The old man warned Arthur in a low voice to find another lake, muttering that the freezing water around that specific property had a dark history of swallowing people whole and never giving them back. Arthur, an inherently stubborn and practical man who did not care for local folklore or ghost stories, convinced himself that a desperate squatter or a fugitive must have hiked in through the dense forest. The thought of a vagrant hiding out in the freezing dark, silently staring down at him to frighten him away from a good fishing spot, sparked a deep anger that temporarily masked his fear. He decided he would go back and confront the trespasser. 2 days later, Arthur returned to the hidden cove exactly at noon. The sun was high and bright, burning away the morning shadows and making the dilapidated cabin look pathetic and ruined rather than menacing. He drove his boat hard onto the rocky shoreline, his heavy boots crunching loudly against the stones in the dead quiet of the cove. He retrieved a heavy steel flashlight from his metal tackle box, gripping it tightly like a club, and marched up the steep, overgrown embankment. The closer he got to the structure, the more he realized how incredibly advanced the decay truly was. The front door was missing entirely, its rusted hinges dangling uselessly from rotting wood. The remaining floorboards of the porch were coated in a thick, wet layer of green moss and slick black decay. Arthur looked at the soft mud surrounding the entrance. There were no footprints. There were no discarded cans, no signs of a recent campfire, no broken branches, and absolutely no indication that another human being had walked up this path in decades. Arthur stepped cautiously through the open doorway. The air inside the cabin was instantly stifling, smelling heavily of wet earth, dead rodents, and rotting pine. The silence inside the walls was oppressive, immediately swallowing the ambient sounds of the wind and the lake behind him. The ground floor was stripped completely bare. The floorboards were covered in a thick, gray, undisturbed layer of dust and fallen debris. In the back corner of the main room, a narrow wooden staircase led up into the pitch-black shadows of the second floor. The steps were severely warped and looked incredibly fragile. Arthur stood at the bottom, his hand gripping the cold steel of the flashlight, and listened. He expected to hear the floorboards creaking above him. He expected the rustle of dirty clothing, a sudden cough, or the panicked, shallow breathing of a cornered squatter. He heard absolutely nothing. He called out, his voice sounding flat and muffled in the damp, dead air, ordering whoever was up there to come down immediately. The only answer was the faint, hollow whisper of the wind moving through the holes in the exposed roof. His heart hammering against his ribs, Arthur slowly began to climb the narrow stairs. Every step groaned loudly under his weight, the sound echoing like gunshots in the quiet house. When he finally reached the landing, he found a short, dark hallway with two open doors. He stepped into the room on the left, the bedroom that directly overlooked the dark water of the cove. It was completely empty. The walls were stripped down to the bare wooden studs, and the ceiling was caving in. He walked slowly over to the window, the floorboards sagging dangerously beneath his heavy boots. He looked out through the grimy glass, seeing the exact spot where his boat was beached far below. Then, his eyes drifted down to the wooden windowsill itself. The layer of gray dust on the wood was nearly an inch thick, perfectly smooth and entirely undisturbed. There were no handprints, there were no footprints on the floor anywhere near the window, but on the inside of the dirty glass, about 5 feet off the ground, was a clean, oval-shaped patch where the decades of grime had been rubbed completely away. In the very center of that clean patch, pressed firmly into the thin layer of cold condensation, was the faint, unmistakable grease print of a human forehead, the bridge of a nose, and 2 hollow cheekbones. Arthur stared at the wet impression on the glass, a terrible, freezing dread pooling in his stomach. The face he had seen from the water had not been looking out at him from the shadows of the room. The face had been pressed directly against the cold glass, unmoving, staring down at him for hours. He slowly backed away from the window, the temperature in the room seeming to plummet around him. As he reached the threshold of the hallway, he heard a sound that would remain burned into his memory for the rest of his life. It did not come from the empty rooms on the second floor. It came from directly beneath him. It was the distinct sound of a heavy, wet footstep landing on the wooden floorboards of the ground level. Then came another, slow, deliberate pacing. Someone, or something, was slowly walking through the thick layer of dust he had just crossed. Arthur stood completely paralyzed on the landing, staring down into the dark open stairwell. He heard the heavy, wet footsteps move toward the bottom of the stairs and stop. He waited for 10 agonizing minutes, unable to breathe, trapped in the freezing dark, but the sound never returned, and no figure ever appeared in the gloom below. Finally, unable to endure the suffocating, unseen terror a moment longer, he bolted down the stairs, ignoring the splintering wood, burst blindly through the empty doorway, and ran frantically to his boat. He rowed with wild, desperate strokes, tearing the skin from his knuckles, not looking back until he was safely in the center of the open lake. Arthur never returned to the remote cove, and he never spoke of the face to the old man at the bait shop. He sold his small aluminum boat the following spring and refused to fish the deep border lakes ever again. According to local residents, the decaying cabin finally surrendered to the elements and collapsed entirely during a massive blizzard in the winter of 2004, folding in on itself until nothing remained but a pile of shattered beams buried under the snow. Yet, some trappers and solitary fishermen who still braved the freezing, deep waters of that specific cove claim that the destruction of the house did not bring peace to the shoreline. They say that on perfectly still, foggy mornings, when the surface of the dark water is undisturbed by the wind, a careful observer can sometimes see a strange reflection in the deep water. It is not the reflection of the surrounding pine trees, or the gray sky, or the ruined wood on the bank. It is the pale, motionless reflection of a face suspended far down in the freezing depths, forever looking up. The chamber beneath the Pennsylvania clay. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to the deep countryside of rural Pennsylvania in the dead of winter. It is not an empty silence. It is heavy, pressing against the windows of isolated homes, thick with the weight of frozen earth and dormant trees. For generations, people living out where the dirt roads end have understood that old houses settle, wooden beams groan, and the wind can mimic the sound of a voice. But there are other sounds that do not belong to the wind or the shifting foundation. Sounds that pull themselves up from the dark, damp earth beneath the floorboards. In the late autumn of 1996, a young family purchased a sprawling, isolated farmhouse situated on 20 acres of overgrown land. The property had sat vacant for over a decade. The previous owners had departed quietly, leaving behind furniture, unwashed dishes, and a reputation among locals that the property was simply too far from town, too secluded, and perhaps too strange to comfortably inhabit. The new owners, a husband, a wife, and their young daughter, saw only the charm of a 19th century build. They appreciated the heavy oak beams, the wide plank floors, and the sprawling root cellar that promised a connection to a simpler, older way of life. For the first 2 months, the house was merely a quiet sanctuary. The family spent their days stripping ancient wallpaper and repainting the bedrooms. When evening fell, the absolute darkness of the countryside swallowed the property. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles down a winding gravel road. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, and no ambient noise from a nearby town. There was only the house, standing alone against the tree line. The subtle shift in the atmosphere began just after the first hard freeze in early December. According to the reports filed much later, the wife was the first to notice the sound. It happened at roughly 2:15 in the morning. She awoke to a profound stillness in her bedroom, a silence so deep it felt as though the air had been pulled from the house. Then a slow, heavy thud echoed from the floor beneath her bed. It was not the sharp crack of wood settling in the cold, it was a dull, rhythmic impact. It sounded like something wrapped in heavy fabric being dragged across a stone floor, followed by a long, agonizing pause, and then another thud. She lay awake for an hour, listening as the dragging sound moved in a tight, restless circle directly beneath the central hallway on the ground floor. The layout of the farmhouse dictated that whatever was making the noise had to be in the deepest part of the basement, a section of the old root cellar that the family had largely ignored due to its overwhelming smell of mildew and wet clay. When morning came, the sounds ceased. The daylight brought logic and rational explanations. The husband suggested it was an old water pipe shuddering in the cold, or perhaps a raccoon that had found its way beneath the foundation. A week passed. The sounds did not return every night, but when they did, they always began after midnight. The rhythm remained identical, a heavy, dragging thud, a pause, a scrape of something hard against stone. It became impossible to sleep through. The atmosphere inside the home grew tense, the air feeling thick and charged with an unspoken anxiety. The family began to walk softly through their own hallways, instinctively afraid of waking whatever seemed to be restless beneath their feet. Late one Saturday afternoon, determined to find the source of the disturbance, the husband took a heavy flashlight and descended the narrow, creaking wooden stairs into the cellar. The basement was divided into 2 distinct sections. The first was a modern utility area housing the furnace and water heater. Beyond that was the original root cellar, a space carved directly into the Pennsylvania earth, lined with crumbling fieldstone and supported by thick, rotting timber. The air down there was perpetually cold, carrying the metallic scent of old soil and rust. He walked through the damp space, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating forgotten mason jars and decaying wooden crates. At the far end of the cellar, hidden behind a towering stack of rotting wooden pallets, he noticed a shadow that did not align with the stone wall. He pulled the heavy pallets aside, his hands blackening with decades of dust. Behind them was a narrow alcove, and set deeply into the stone of that alcove was a door. It was not a normal basement door. It was constructed of solid, thick oak, reinforced with heavy strips of blackened iron. There was no doorknob. Instead, a massive iron hasp was bolted to the wood, secured by a rusted padlock the size of a man's fist. More disturbing than the lock was the thick, industrial chain wrapped tightly around the hinges and the hasp, effectively binding the door to the stone frame. The chain was severely rusted, suggesting it had not been moved in 50 years or more. The husband stood in the cold, staring at the barricade. The door bowed slightly outward, as if warped by time or pressure. He stepped closer, raising his hand to touch the rusted metal of the lock. Before his fingers could make contact, He felt a vibration traveling through the stone floor and into the soles of his boots. He froze. From the other side of the heavy oak, mere inches from his face, came the distinct, unmistakable sound of something shifting its weight. It was a slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy and organic moving against the wood. He backed away slowly, his breath misting in the cold cellar air. He did not turn his back on the door until he had retreated to the wooden stairs. When he returned to the main floor, he locked the cellar door behind him and told his wife about the chained room. They agreed not to force the padlock. They rationalized that the previous owners had sealed the room for structural reasons, perhaps to prevent a collapse or to block off a damp, unventilated space. They tried to convince themselves that the sounds were simply acoustic anomalies trapped in a hollow chamber, but the fear had already taken root. The following week, the wife was sorting through debris in the unfinished attic, looking for old architectural plans that might explain the layout of the foundation. Tucked away beneath a loose floorboard near the chimney brickwork, she found a small, tarnished tin box. Inside were several dried, brittle documents and a stack of black and white photographs. The edges of the photos were curled and yellowed with age. Written in faded black ink on the back of the topmost picture was the year 1924. She brought the photographs down to the kitchen table, wiping the dust from their surfaces. The first few images were mundane. Landscapes of the farm before the trees had grown tall, a picture of a horse-drawn wagon, a stern-looking family standing rigidly on the front porch. But the final 3 photographs made her blood run cold. The pictures showed the basement. Specifically, they showed the heavy oak door. However, in the photographs, the door was wide open, revealing the room beyond. The flash of the old camera illuminated a small, windowless chamber constructed of thick, rough-hewn stone. There was no furniture in the room save for a single heavy wooden chair positioned facing the furthest corner. But it was the walls that commanded attention. The stone surfaces were covered in deep, erratic grooves. They were frantic, overlapping scratches that traveled from the floor all the way up to the low ceiling, as if something desperate had tried to claw its way through solid rock. The final photograph was the most unsettling. It was taken from inside the small chamber, looking out toward the open doorway. The heavy iron door was visible, and the massive padlock hung open. But the camera flash illuminated the inside of the door itself. The thick oak was heavily gouged, splintered, and stained with dark, irregular patches. Whatever had been in that room had not been protecting itself from the outside, it had been trapped inside. And according to the state of the door in the photograph, it had spent years trying to get out. The family did not sleep that night. They sat together in the living room, the tin box resting on the coffee table. Outside, a light snow began to fall, blanketing the isolated farm in a deep, smothering quiet. Inside, the house felt entirely different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a vessel sitting on top of a cage. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the noises began again. This time, they were not subtle. The deep, heavy thudding started directly beneath the living room floor. It was louder than it had ever been, vibrating through the floorboards with enough force to rattle the glass in the window frames. The husband and wife sat paralyzed on the sofa, clutching each other as the rhythmic dragging paced furiously back and forth beneath them. Then the dragging stopped. A new sound echoed up through the heating grates. It was the sharp, metallic clinking of a heavy chain being pulled taut. Someone, or something, was standing on the other side of that basement door. The family listened in absolute horror as the rusted iron chain groaned under immense pressure. The sound was impossible. The chain was wrapped on the outside of the door, secured by the padlock. Yet, the horrific squeal of stressed metal suggested that tremendous force was being applied from the inside, pushing the heavy oak door outward, stretching the rusted links to their breaking point. The husband stood up, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the door leading down to the cellar. He took a hesitant step forward. His wife grabbed his arm, shaking her head violently, her eyes wide with terror. But a strange compulsion seemed to guide him. He walked to the cellar door and pressed his ear against the painted wood. From the depths of the basement, beneath the groan of the straining iron, he heard a sound that would haunt his reports to investigators for years to come. It was not a roar, and it was not a cry. It was the wet, ragged sound of breathing. It was heavy, labored, and unnaturally loud, echoing through the hollow space of the cellar like a bellows drawing in the cold, damp air. And layered beneath that breathing was the frantic, continuous sound of fingernails tearing into hard oak. Suddenly, the house fell completely silent. The pressure on the chain released with a sharp metallic clank. The scratching stopped, the heavy breathing faded into the ambient hum of the winter wind outside. The silence that followed was suffocating. Worse than the noise had been, it was the silence of something waiting. They did not wait for the sun to rise. The family gathered their coats, woke their sleeping daughter, and walked out into the freezing night. They climbed into their vehicle and drove away down the dark gravel road, leaving the lights on and the front door unlocked. They never spent another night in the farmhouse. When they eventually returned a month later with a local contractor and a law enforcement officer to retrieve their belongings, the house was just as they had left it. The winter air had chilled the interior to freezing temperatures. The officer, listening to their frantic story, agreed to inspect the basement. He descended the stairs with a heavy flashlight, hand resting cautiously on his service weapon. He found the hidden alcove exactly as the husband had described. He found the heavy oak door, he found the massive iron padlock, but the heavy industrial chain, the rusted metal that had bound the door closed for decades, lay entirely severed on the dirt floor. The thick steel links had not been cut with a tool, they had been stretched and snapped, twisted apart by a force that defied explanation. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, resting open by about 3 inches. The officer slowly pushed the door wide. The chamber inside was empty. There was no wooden chair, as seen in the 1920s photographs. There were only the stone walls, covered from floor to ceiling in deep, ancient scratches. And yet, the air inside the small room was strangely warm, carrying a thick copper scent that made the officer feel immediately nauseous. The family sold the property at a massive loss a few months later to an out-of-state developer. The farmhouse was eventually demolished, the stone foundation collapsed and filled in with heavy machinery. Today, the land is nothing more than a sprawling field of overgrown weeds and wild brush. But local legends persist among the people who live out on those dark country roads. They say that if you walk out into that specific field on a quiet winter night, long after midnight, you can still hear the rhythmic sound of something heavy dragging itself across the frozen Pennsylvania clay. The silence at Cold Creek Tower. Deep in the remote stretches of the Cascade Mountains, there are places where the tree canopy grows so thick that the forest floor never sees the sun. Above this dark ocean of pine and fir, suspended on wooden legs 70 feet in the air, sits the Cold Creek Fire Lookout. It is a fragile glass box in the sky built to watch over hundreds of miles of unbroken wilderness. For most of its history, it was a place of quiet solitude, a sanctuary for those who preferred the company of the wind over the noise of the world. But according to local forestry legends, the tower has stood completely abandoned since the late summer of 1974, left to rot in the damp mountain air because of what happened to the last man who lived inside it. His name, according to the old ranger logs, was Thomas. He was a veteran of the wilderness, a quiet man in his early 50s who had spent over a decade working solitary seasons in various watchtowers across the Pacific Northwest. The job of a fire lookout requires a specific type of mind. For 3 months at a time, there is no human contact, there are no visitors. There is only the sweeping view of the horizon, the shifting weather patterns, and the endless, crushing silence of the mountains. Thomas was used to this rhythm. He arrived at Cold Creek in early June, carrying a radio, a few books, and enough canned provisions to last until the first snow of November. For the first 2 months, his daily reports to the main ranger station in the valley were completely routine. He called in at 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening, reporting humidity levels, wind direction, and lightning strikes. His voice over the radio was always calm, steady, and professional. But as August approached, the atmosphere in the mountains began to change. A thick, unseasonable fog settled into the valleys, refusing to burn off during the day. The air grew heavy and unnaturally still. Birds stopped calling from the canopy below. It was during this period of oppressive weather that the radio operators at the base station noticed a subtle shift in Thomas and his transmissions. He began calling in outside of his scheduled times. At first, the calls were brief and pertained to minor details: a strange shadow he saw moving along the distant ridge, or a patch of dead trees he had not noticed before. But soon, the reports became less about the forest and more about the immediate area surrounding the base of his tower. On the evening of August 14th, at approximately 9:30 p.m., Thomas broke radio silence to ask if any hikers had registered for permits in the Cold Creek sector. The operator informed him that the sector was closed due to the fog and poor trail conditions. No one was out there. Thomas paused for a long time before replying that he had seen a flashlight beam moving slowly through the trees about 200 yards east of his position. The operator, assuming it was a lost hunter, told Thomas to keep his searchlight off and remain in the cabin until morning. Thomas agreed, but his voice sounded tense. He mentioned that the light did not look like a standard flashlight. It was too pale, and it did not bounce or sway like it was being carried by someone walking. It simply glided through the timber low to the ground before winking out in the thick mist. 3 days later, the situation escalated. It was just past midnight when the base station radio crackled to life. Thomas was speaking in a hushed, strained whisper, as if he were afraid of being overheard. He reported that someone or something was standing at the edge of the tree line just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The radio operator asked if he could see a face or clothing. Thomas replied that it was too dark, but he could see a tall, misshapen silhouette. It had been standing absolutely motionless for over an hour, facing the tower. The operator suggested sending a patrol up the mountain at first light. Thomas agreed, but before he signed off, he muttered something that sent a chill through the dispatch room. He said the shape had not arrived by walking out of the woods. He said he had been watching the tree line, and the shadow had simply materialized from the fog, as if it had seeped up from the damp earth itself. The patrol that hiked up the next morning found nothing. The ground around the tower was undisturbed. There were no boot prints in the mud, no broken branches, and no signs of a camp. The Rangers spent 2 hours checking the perimeter before hiking back down, writing the incident off as a trick of the fog, and the severe isolation taking its toll on the lookout. They advised Thomas to take a few days off and come down to the valley, but he refused. He insisted that he was fine and that the tower was his responsibility. That decision would become the focal point of a legend that has haunted the Regional Forestry Service for decades. The final radio transmission from Cold Creek Tower occurred on the night of August 21st. It began at exactly 3:15 in the morning. The operator on duty was half asleep when the console burst into a loud, hissing static. Through the heavy interference, Thomas spoke. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was frantic, breathless, and stripped of all professionalism. He did not use his call sign. He simply said it was at the bottom of the stairs. The operator, now fully awake, asked him to repeat the message. Thomas ignored the request. The microphone on his end was keyed open, broadcasting the ambient sound of the glass cabin into the dispatch room. The operator could hear Thomas breathing heavily, the sound of the wind rattling the window panes, and then something else. According to the official transcripts and the memories of the operator, a rhythmic, heavy sound began to echo through the radio. It was the distinct noise of weight being placed on wooden planks. Footsteps, but they were wrong. They were far too slow and far too heavy for a human being. The Cold Creek Tower had exactly 60 wooden steps winding up its metal frame. The operator listened in frozen horror as the slow, agonizingly deliberate footsteps climbed higher and higher. A heavy thump, a long pause, another heavy thump, another pause. The old wood groaned in protest under a massive weight. Through the radio, Thomas began to pray softly. He did not ask for help, knowing the nearest station was hours away. He simply backed himself into the furthest corner of the cabin. The footsteps reached the landing just outside the heavy wooden trapdoor that led into the room. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and Thomas taking ragged breaths. Then a sharp, metallic screech tore through the static. It was the sound of the heavy iron latch on the trapdoor being slowly turned from the outside. A latch that could only be reached by someone standing on the final step. Thomas let out a single, sharp intake of air, and then the radio went completely dead. The connection was severed, leaving nothing but an empty hiss filling the dispatch room. The operator called out frantically for the next hour, but no response ever came from the dark mountains. By sunrise, a full search and rescue team was navigating the steep, treacherous trail up to Cold Creek. They arrived at the clearing just before noon. The tower stood exactly as it always had, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. But when the Rangers climbed the 60 steps and pushed open the trapdoor, they found the glass cabin completely empty. Thomas was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, the windows were intact, the furniture was upright, and a cup of coffee was sitting cold on the desk. The radio was still switched on, the microphone resting on the floor, his boots, his jacket, and his emergency flare gun were all still hanging on their hooks. The only strange detail the search party noted was a foul, stagnant odor lingering in the cabin, smelling strongly of wet soil and ozone, and deep scratch marks etched into the thick wood of the trapdoor on the inside of the cabin. Despite weeks of searching the surrounding valleys and ravines with dogs and helicopters, not a single trace of Thomas was ever found. The Forestry Service officially classified it as a case of severe psychological break, suggesting he had wandered off into the woods in a state of delusion and succumbed to the elements. The tower was locked, boarded up, and eventually decommissioned. But the legend of Cold Creek did not end with the official report. Over the next 30 years, hikers and rogue campers who ventured too close to the abandoned structure began to return with deeply unsettling stories. Those who have camped in the shadow of the tall, rusting legs report waking up in the dead of night to a sudden, absolute drop in temperature. They speak of the forest going completely silent, the crickets and the wind simply stopping. And then, in the suffocating quiet, they hear it. The slow, heavy creak of the lowest wooden step bending under an immense, unseen weight. The sound of wet, heavy footsteps beginning a slow ascent toward the empty glass box in the sky. Few people ever stay long enough to hear if the footsteps reach the top, but those who do claim that when the sun finally rises, the old iron latch on the trapdoor is always found unhooked, swinging gently in the cold mountain air. The hospital wing they sealed in 1968. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to abandoned places. It is not an empty silence, but a heavy one, thick with the weight of settled dust and stagnant air. In the hollow corridors of old, forgotten buildings, this silence feels almost expectant, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. But the silence in the east wing of the Oak Haven Memorial Hospital was different. According to those who worked the night shifts in the decades before the entire facility finally closed down, the East Wing was never truly silent. It was merely waiting behind a wall of cinder blocks and welded steel, sealed away from the rest of the world in the winter of 1968. Oak Haven Memorial was a sprawling, multi-story structure built in the early 1920s, a monument to the Gothic architectural styles that favored dark red brick, narrow windows, and steep roofs. It sat on the edge of a dense, sprawling forest in a quiet valley, originally designed as a sanatorium for patients suffering from highly contagious respiratory illnesses. As the decades passed and modern medicine evolved, the facility transitioned into a general hospital. Corridors were modernized with pale green paint and checkered linoleum floors. Fluorescent lights replaced the old incandescent bulbs, but the east wing, extending deeply toward the tree line, remained largely untouched, a relic of an older, much darker era of medicine. It was a sprawling appendage of the hospital, housing 4 wards, a secondary surgical theater, and a hydrotherapy room that had long been out of use. In the late autumn of 1968, the hospital administration made a sudden, uncharacteristically quiet decision. Without public fanfare or extensive staff meetings, an order was handed down to evacuate the East Wing entirely. Patients were relocated over the course of 48 hours, equipment was left behind, beds remained fully made, surgical tools were left in their trays. The official explanation, circulated in brief memos to the remaining staff, cited severe structural instability and the discovery of dangerous asbestos in the walls and ceilings. It was deemed too expensive to renovate and too hazardous to leave open. But the method of closure immediately sparked quiet rumors among the medical staff. The maintenance crew was not instructed to simply lock the heavy wooden doors. Instead, independent contractors were brought in from outside the valley. They worked through the night, using welding torches to permanently fuse the hinges and frames of the heavy steel fire doors that separated the East Wing from the main building. When the welding was finished, masons arrived and built a thick, solid wall of cinder blocks directly in front of the doors, plastering and painting over it to match the rest of the corridor. It was as if the hospital had decided to amputate a part of itself and bury the stump. For the first few years, the newly built wall was nothing more than an oddity, a dead end at the far side of the second floor. Nurses and doctors grew accustomed to the abrupt termination of the hallway, but as time crept on, the building began to age, and the settling foundation seemed to awaken something on the other side of the plaster. The rumors began as scattered whispers in the break rooms, mostly from those who worked the deeply unpopular hours between midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning. It started with the ventilation system. The air ducts in the main hospital were supposed to have been entirely severed from the East Wing during the sealing process. Yet, on cold, still nights, when the wind died down and the ambient noise of the hospital faded into a low, electrical hum, the night staff reported feeling cold drafts seeping from the baseboards near the dead-end wall. With the cold came the smells. According to numerous witness accounts logged in informal employee diaries, the air carried the distinct metallic scent of old iodine, mingled with the heavy, unmistakable odor of stale copper and decaying linen. It was the scent of a crowded, unventilated sick ward drifting into a modernized hallway. Then came the sounds. They were faint at first, easily dismissed as the groans of settling pipes or the shifting of old brick in the winter cold. But by the early 1980s, the auditory phenomena had become too distinct, too rhythmic to be ignored. A seasoned maintenance worker, whose duties included buffing the floors on the second level, often claimed he would pause his machine just to listen. When the buffer was turned off, he reported hearing a slow, dragging sound coming from deep within the sealed wing. It sounded exactly like a heavy wooden chair being pulled across a dry, unpolished floor. The dragging would stop for several minutes, only to resume again, always moving parallel to the dividing wall. He was not the only one. Nurses walking past the junction near the sealed wing frequently reported the sound of metal wheels. The squeak was rhythmic and agonizingly slow, perfectly mirroring the sound of an old, rusted medical gurney being pushed down a long corridor. The sound would originate from far down the sealed wing, grow gradually louder as it approached the dividing wall, and then stop completely right on the other side of the cinder blocks. Those who stood and listened claimed they could almost feel the weight of whoever or whatever was standing just inches away, separated only by concrete and welded steel. The atmosphere around the dead end grew increasingly oppressive. Staff members began to unconsciously avoid the area, taking longer routes through the basement or the third floor to bypass the second floor junction entirely. There was a palpable sense of dread that hung in the air, a feeling of being closely observed by unseen eyes through the solid wall. Local legends grew, suggesting that not every patient had been relocated in 1968. Some whispered that a highly infectious, undocumented outbreak had occurred, and the administration had chosen containment over treatment. Others believed the wing had been used for experimental procedures that went horribly wrong, leaving an imprint so deep it permanently stained the atmosphere. None of these theories could be proven, but the fear they generated was undeniably real. The tension reached its peak during a severe winter storm in late January of 1993. The valley was buried under 3 feet of snow, rendering the roads completely impassable. The hospital was running on a skeletal crew with only a handful of nurses and one attending physician to oversee the remaining patients. The wind howled against the narrow windows, rattling the old frames and sending drafts slicing through the corridors. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, a massive branch from an ancient oak tree collapsed under the weight of the ice, tearing through the main power lines. The hospital was plunged into total darkness. It took nearly a full minute for the emergency diesel generators in the basement to engage. During those 60 seconds of absolute, suffocating blackness, the silence in the hospital was absolute. But a young night nurse who had been organizing charts at the second-floor station near the dead end later claimed that the silence did not extend to the east wing. As soon as the power failed, the sounds behind the wall erupted. She reported hearing the distinct, chaotic noise of a fully occupied ward. There were dozens of footsteps, frantic and heavy, echoing on bare tile. She heard the sharp, terrifying sound of glass shattering, followed by the clattering cascade of metal surgical instruments being violently swept off a tray onto the floor. But most disturbing of all were the voices. They were not screaming, and they were not calling for help. It was a low, overlapping murmur of hushed, panicked whispering. Hundreds of voices blending together into a single, wet hum that seemed to vibrate right through the cinder blocks. The nurse stood frozen in the dark, her heart pounding against her ribs, unable to run, unable to breathe. When the emergency lights finally flickered to life, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the linoleum, the whispering abruptly stopped. The chaotic sounds of movement vanished. The nurse slowly backed away from the desk, her eyes fixed on the blank plaster wall. But the silence that followed was broken by one final, solitary sound. It was the heavy metallic scrape of something massive being dragged directly up to the welded steel doors behind the cinder blocks. Then came a deliberate, rhythmic pounding. It was slow and incredibly heavy, shaking the dust from the ceiling tiles above her. Thud, a pause. Thud, a pause. It was as if someone on the inside was testing the strength of the barrier, methodically striking the steel from within the dark, forgotten corridor. The nurse abandoned her post, fleeing to the first floor and refusing to return to the second level for the remainder of her employment. Her account was never officially recorded by the hospital administration, but it was passed down through the staff like a grim inheritance. The hospital continued to operate for another decade, but the lingering dread eventually took its toll. Funding dwindled, the modern facilities in the neighboring city drew away the patients, and in the early spring of 2004, Oak Haven Memorial permanently closed its doors. The remaining equipment was auctioned off, the windows were boarded up, and the sprawling brick structure was left to the mercy of the surrounding forest. Today, the building sits in a state of advanced decay. The roof sags, the gutters are choked with dead leaves, and the once sterile corridors are covered in a thick layer of moss and debris. Urban explorers and local teenagers occasionally brave the property, venturing into the dark, damp halls with flashlights and cameras. They found empty patient rooms, peeling paint, and the scattered remains of old medical files. But those who ventured to the second floor always noted the same strange anomaly. The dead-end wall remains perfectly intact. While the rest of the hospital has been heavily vandalized, the plaster covering the cinder blocks is completely untouched. There is no graffiti, no signs of attempted forced entry, and no structural collapse. It stands as solid and imposing as it did the day it was built. According to the local legends that still circulate among the residents of the valley, if you stand in that ruined hallway at the dead of night, when the wind dies down and the forest goes completely still, you do not need to press your ear to the wall to hear them. You can stand several feet back, holding your breath in the dark, and wait. Eventually, from deep within the lightless, airless depths of the East Wing, you will hear the slow, agonizing squeak of a rusted metal wheel, rolling steadily toward the sealed doors, waiting for someone to finally let them out. Lost where no one goes. In late October of 2019, a man walked into the backcountry outside Missoula, Montana, and did not return. Evan Klein was 29, a seasonal trail crew worker who took side jobs guiding anglers in the Clark Fork region. He told friends he needed quiet days before winter, and he wanted to scout a rarely used route. His plan was a 2-night loop near the Rattlesnake Wilderness, starting from the edge of Missoula County. State records show he had been cited once for an expired plate, but nothing suggested a reason to disappear. The route he described was steep and brushy, and locals said it was where people went to avoid people. On the morning he left, Evan stopped at a gas station near Bonner and bought 2 energy drinks and a paper topo map. A clerk later told deputies he seemed normal, though the clerk could not recall the color of Evan's pack. Archived notes from a county file from 2009 described that same station as a common last stop for hikers. Some locals claimed the clerk was mixing Evan up with another man, and investigators never confirmed the purchase with video. Dispatch logs show a small storm warning posted that afternoon, with temperatures dropping fast after sundown. Evan texted one friend that the forecast looked manageable, and he wrote that he had extra layers. Around noon, Evan met Leah Serrano at a pullout near a trailhead outside Missoula. Leah was 34, an ER nurse who hiked on her days off and kept careful lists in a pocket notebook. She had asked Evan for a quick route suggestion because she was training for a longer trip in spring. Reportedly, Evan offered to walk the first mile with her, then peel off onto his loop. Leah later said he joked about the quiet ridge, and he pointed at a line of darker timber. Her notebook entry lists the time as 12:15, but her phone data suggests closer to 12:40. Leah's account became one of the last confirmed sightings, yet even that record has cracks. She said Evan wore a gray beanie and carried an orange dry bag strapped under his pack. In a later interview, she added a detail about a small radio set clipped to his shoulder strap. Searchers never recovered a radio set, and none of Evan's friends remembered him owning one. Investigators noted that stress can sharpen some memories and erase others, and they wrote that her timeline shifted each retelling. Records conflict on the exact junction where they separated because the first mile contains several unofficial spurs. By evening, Evan's phone stopped checking in with towers, which was not unusual in that drainage. He had told his sister, Maren, that he would message by the second night if service allowed. Maren was 31, a veterinary technician in Spokane, and she had been the person who tracked his patterns. When no message came, she waited through the next day and tried not to panic. On the third morning, she called the Missoula County Sheriff's Office, and she gave them Evan's vehicle description. Dispatch logs show the call was logged at 9:12, with a note reading, "Overdue hiker, possible off-trail." Deputy Ron McAdams, 46, took the initial report and drove to the trailhead area before noon. He found Evan's truck parked where Maren said it would be, and the passenger window was cracked. The keys were not inside, and there was no note under the wiper. McAdams photographed the tires and the ground because overnight rain had softened the soil. In his first write-up, he noted only one clear shoe print near the tailgate, then nothing readable beyond it. County records show he requested volunteer search teams, and he asked for a dog unit if one was available. The first search wave moved that afternoon, with a small group of deputies and local volunteers. They followed the main trail for several miles, checking side drainages and calling Evan's name. The air smelled wet and cold, and the wind kept shifting through the lodgepole stands. Search leaders later said voice calls carried poorly, and they relied on whistles and radio updates. Reportedly, a volunteer found a small strip of orange tape tied to a branch, about shoulder height. Nobody could prove it belonged to Evan, because trail crews also used orange tape in the area. That night, temperatures fell below freezing in the higher basins, and a thin crust formed over puddles. Deputy McAdams requested a helicopter at first light, but weather reports suggested low ceilings. State records show the aircraft was delayed until mid-morning, when the cloud deck lifted slightly. From above, the terrain looked like a series of green folds with dark cuts where creeks ran. The pilot flew slow passes along likely corridors, and a spotter scanned for bright colors. No movement was seen, and no smoke appeared from any ridge. On day 2, a canine team arrived and started near the truck, then moved up the main trail. The handler later said the dog showed interest in the first mile, then lost focus near a rocky outcrop. Investigators wrote that scent can pool in cold air, then break apart when wind funnels through gullies. The dog led them briefly toward a creek, then doubled back and circled a stand of young fur. Searchers found an old fire ring there, but it looked years unused and filled with wet needles. Some locals claimed that spot was a known party site, and they argued it meant nothing. Leah returned with her notebook and walked deputies through her last meeting with Evan. She pointed to a place where the trail brushed a steep slope, and she said Evan stepped off toward a faint path. McAdams marked the area and flagged it for a grid search because that spur did not appear on standard maps. Reportedly, another hiker had mentioned seeing someone matching Evan's build near that same slope, though the hiker could not recall a face. Investigators never confirmed that second witness through contact details because the name in the note was misspelled. Records conflict on whether the report came in on day 1 or day 3. By day 4, the search widened into harder country, including a ravine filled with deadfall. Volunteers moved slowly because every step could twist an ankle, and many carried extra layers against sudden squalls. Dispatch logs show repeated warnings about hypothermia risk for searchers themselves, and leaders set strict turnaround times. A team reported hearing a single shout in the distance, then nothing after they answered back. Investigators wrote that wind can mimic voices, and they did not treat it as a confirmed signal. Still, it was logged, and it pulled resources toward a drainage that few wanted to enter. In that drainage, searchers found a glove half buried in wet leaves near the creek edge. It was dark blue, medium size, and the lining was damp, as if recently soaked. Evan's sister said he owned similar gloves, but she could not swear to that exact pair. The glove had no name tag, and there were no unique markings that matched photos from his social media. State records show the glove was bagged and stored, yet later notes suggest it was misplaced during equipment transfers. Investigators never confirmed whether it was tested for DNA, and archive notes mention pending lab capacity. As the week went on, the story began to draw in local rumors, and those rumors pushed against the paperwork. Some locals claimed Evan had been seen in a bar near downtown Missoula 2 nights after he vanished. Others said he owed money to someone in the valley, and they hinted at trouble with drugs. Deputy McAdams documented the claims, then wrote that no surveillance or receipts supported them. County file notes say the bar report came from an anonymous caller, and the caller refused to leave a number. Investigators never confirmed the claim, and they kept the search focus on terrain and weather. Weather shifted again, and snow fell higher up, while rain soaked the lower trailheads. Volunteers described slick rock and sudden fog, and several teams had to be pulled back early. Dispatch logs show one medical call for a sprained knee, which reduced manpower during a crucial window. A state SAR coordinator later wrote that early snow can hide tracks, then preserve them, which complicates what a boot print means. McAdams requested a pause to reassess, then redeployed teams to likely exit points. Some locals claimed that pause proved the office was giving up, but records show the search continued in smaller sections. Marin drove from Spokane and met deputies at the command post, bringing Evan's spare jacket for scent. She was calm on the surface, but witnesses said her hands shook when she held Evan's last text message. She asked about his habits, and she repeated that he avoided risky creek crossings after a past fall. Investigators wrote that Evan had a minor knee injury from a trail job in 2018, though it had not kept him from hiking. They also noted that he sometimes left established routes to find solitude, which increased the unknowns. Reportedly, Marin asked whether anyone had checked old cabins, and she was told there were none in that zone. Then, a new lead surfaced from an unlikely place, an archived note in a county file from 2009. That file described a missing hunter case in the same wilderness boundary, with similar weather and similar timeline gaps. The note mentioned an unmaintained logging road that did not appear on modern recreation maps. Investigators wondered if Evan had used that corridor as a shortcut, because he often talked about old roads. A volunteer team was sent to look for signs of recent travel along that forgotten cut. They found the roadbed, but it was choked with alder and slick mud, and no clear prints survived the rain. On day 9, a searcher found a crumpled snack wrapper wedged between rocks near a small waterfall. The brand matched one Evan favored, but it was common in every gas station around Missoula. The wrapper had been torn open, yet it was not sun-faded, which suggested it had not been there all summer. Investigators photographed it, logged the GPS point, and collected it as possible evidence. Some locals claimed the wrapper was staged to mislead, and they pointed to its neat placement. Investigators never confirmed staging, and they wrote that water flow can trap light items in odd places. The case became a pattern of partial clues, each one pulling in a different direction. A volunteer reported finding a shallow depression in grass that looked like a bivvy spot, but it could have been elk bedding. Another team discovered fresh-cut branches, but trail workers sometimes cleared brush for safety. Dispatch logs show multiple false alarms from hikers who thought they saw a pack, then realized it was a stump. Deputy McAdams kept a running map of all reports, yet the center of probability never settled. Records conflict on whether Evan planned a loop or an out and back because his note to a friend used casual language. 2 weeks after the report, the official search shifted from active rescue to limited recovery operations. That change was logged in the county file with wording that emphasized weather and resource constraints. Marin did not argue, but she asked for regular checks when conditions improved. She also asked about cell data, because she believed one last tower ping might exist. Investigators requested records from the provider, and state records show a response arrived in early December. The data listed a brief connection attempt on the first night, yet it did not include a precise location beyond a general sector. Winter closed the higher ridges, and the wilderness became quieter, except for wind and occasional snow machine reports outside boundaries. In February of 2020, a trapper told the sheriff's office he had found something plastic near a creek bend. Deputy McAdams followed up when roads allowed, but the trapper could not relocate the spot in deep snow. Records conflict on whether the trapper's original call included coordinates because the dispatch summary was brief. Some locals claimed the trapper was unreliable, and they said he enjoyed attention. Investigators never confirmed intent, and they filed it as an unverified lead. Spring melt brought new access, and a small team returned to the drainage where the glove had been found. They moved slowly along the creek edges, scanning for fabrics snagged in brush. Reportedly, they found a fragment of orange dry bag material caught on a branch, ripped and sun-dulled. Leah's earlier statement about an orange bag returned to the file, and McAdams noted the match in color only. The fragment had no serial mark, and it could have come from any brand or any year. Investigators photographed it, bagged it, and wrote that water travel could explain the distance from the trail. That fragment revived public interest, and with it came harsher theories. Some locals claimed Evan had met someone on the trail, then been pushed into the creek corridor. Others argued he had intentionally vanished because he wanted a new life without debt or family. State records show no bank activity after his disappearance, and no passport use was recorded. Investigators never confirmed foul play, but they also could not rule it out, because wilderness can erase evidence quickly. County notes mentioned that no obvious predator activity was documented, though scavengers were always possible. The file remained open, with periodic checks scheduled when tips arrived. In late summer of 2021, Hikers reported a faded gray beanie on a ridge above the drainage. A recovery team climbed up and found a beanie, but it was not Evan's size and had a children's label inside. Dispatch logs show the report was closed as unrelated, yet it added to the sense that the area produced constant near matches. Investigators noted that high-use seasons create a clutter of lost items, which can mimic a missing person trail. Some locals claimed the wrong beanie proved the office was careless, but records show the team documented it properly. The ridge remained on the map because it was still a plausible route for a solo hiker. Leah kept hiking, but she stopped going into that particular section of the wilderness. In an interview recorded in 2022, she said she still replayed the moment Evan stepped off toward the trees. She did not claim anything supernatural, yet she said the silence afterward felt like a door closing. Investigators never treated her feelings as evidence, but they kept her statements on file because she remained the last reliable contact. Her notebook pages were photocopied and stored with the county file, and the original stayed with her. Records conflict on whether she gave her phone to investigators because one form says yes and another says no. Deputy McAdams eventually retired, and the file was transferred to a new supervisor with fewer memories of the first week. The new supervisor requested a summary, and archived notes show McAdams wrote a final memo emphasizing the terrain hazards. He listed creek crossings, deadfall, sudden weather shifts, and the temptation to follow game trails that lead nowhere. He also noted the unresolved evidence chain issue with the glove, calling it unfortunate but common. State records show the case status remained active, missing, not presumed dead, for administrative reasons. That choice mattered to Mrballen because it kept the possibility of new searches alive. The last significant tip came from a hunter in October of 2023, almost 4 years after Evan vanished. The hunter reportedly found a damaged map case and a broken compass near a scree field, then left them to mark later. When deputies returned, the items were gone and no one could confirm the exact spot. Records conflict on whether the hunter had taken photos because he first said yes and later said his phone had died. Some locals claimed another person must have removed the items, while investigators wrote that weather and animals can move loose gear. The tip was logged, added to the map, and filed without resolution. Today, Evan Klein's case sits in Missoula County, files as a long list of maybes, each one grounded in imperfect records. Dispatch logs, state records, and archive notes keep the timeline alive, yet none of them explain the gap after he left Leah. Some locals claimed they knew what happened, but their stories never lined up, and investigators never confirmed the worst rumors. The wilderness outside Missoula remains real and ordinary, with trails that fade into brush and drainages that hide what falls into them. Evan went to a place he believed he understood, and the only proven fact is that he did not come back. He followed the wrong trail. On a cold Saturday near Ely, Minnesota, a hiker stepped off a marked route and did not step back on. Dispatch logs later showed one brief call, then only whined through pines and a fading battery icon. Some locals claimed he was seen near an old portage. Investigators never confirmed it. Evan Rourke was 34, a utility line inspector who spent weekdays driving gravel roads across northern Minnesota. He came north for a simple goal: scout a quieter loop before spring overtime began. He told friends he wanted a trail with fewer footprints, something that felt like work without the paycheck. State records show he checked in at a motel outside Ely, then bought jerky and hand warmers. He chose an area locals call the Fernberg Corridor, a gate road that feeds into the Superior National Forest. The plan was modest, a half-day walk that ended at his truck before dusk settled. Archived notes from a county file from 2009 described similar visitors underestimating distance and light. Evan carried a phone, a small headlamp, and a paper map folded into quarters. Reportedly, he left his heavier pack behind, thinking the route stayed close to water. The first miles were calm, with hard snow under boots and black spruce casting thin shadows. A trail register near a junction listed his name and time, the ink pressed hard like a rushed signature. He followed a blue blaze line until it forked toward a lake inlet. Then he hesitated. Records conflict on whether he turned left to the inlet or continued straight toward a ridge. Investigators later noted 2 partial prints leaving the main tread, then nothing consistent afterward. Leah Rourke was 29, an emergency room nurse in Duluth who knew Evans' habits and his stubborn patience. When his evening text never arrived, she waited, then called the motel clerk after midnight. The clerk said Evans' truck was still parked, its windshield frosted, and its cab empty. Dispatch logs show Leah called the county line at 6:12 a.m., voice steady but clipped. The deputy who answered asked about gear, and she described the light pack with a tone she later regretted. Searchers met at a trailhead outside Ely, where the air smelled like exhaust and wet cedar chips. Marco Devereaux, 41, was a volunteer deputy and snowmobile mechanic who knew the backroads by heart. He led the first group because he owned a GPS unit and carried a handheld radio. State records show temperatures hovered below freezing, with gusts that erased tracks in minutes. Some locals claimed the wind that morning was worse, deeper in the trees, like it came off open water. They found Evans' boot prints for less than a quarter mile past the fork, shallow and uneven near a cluster of alders. The line angled away from the official trail, crossing toward a narrow band of darker trees. Reportedly, there were drag marks, but later photographs in the county file were too soft to confirm. Marco flagged the area and called for a dog team, then waited beside a boulder with lichen like dried paint. Leah arrived in the afternoon, eyes fixed on the snow more than on anyone speaking. The dogs started strong, pulling toward the inlet where ice met reeds and the shoreline fell away. Their handler noted a sudden stop near a small clearing, then a circle, then a refusal to continue. Investigators never confirmed a cause, though some locals claimed wolves had moved through overnight. State records show no fresh wolf sign was formally logged, yet several volunteers later described distant howls. The handler wrote that scent can scatter over ice, making a trail feel like several trails at once. By evening, the search widened to include a portage trail that locals used for years without signage. Archived notes from 2011 mentioned a similar junction where hikers drifted into the wrong corridor. The portage looked like a trail, packed by old snowshoes and cut by fallen branches that formed false edges. Evans' phone location data, recovered later, placed him within a broad circle that covered both routes. Records conflict on whether the last ping came from the ridgeline or from the frozen lake surface nearby. At 9:03 p.m., dispatch logs recorded a short call from Evans' number to 911 that cut out after 13 seconds. The audio was mostly breath, then a scrape, then a single word that sounded like trail or rail. The call did not reconnect, and the tower data only narrowed the area to several square miles. Investigators later said the phone may have been in a pocket, muffling anything spoken. Some locals claimed the word was help, but the archived clip was too degraded for certainty. The next morning brought fresh snow, bright enough to hide older prints under a clean sheet. A state helicopter made 2 passes, but the canopy swallowed most shadows before they reached the ground. Marco led a line search along a bog edge where sedges poked through ice like broken needles. They found a single glove, black and thin, wedged under a cedar root with no matching prints nearby. Leah identified it as Evans, based on a small repair stitch she had sewn the previous winter. County file notes from 2009 included warnings about old cut lines from logging days. These narrow corridors can look like maintained trails, especially when snow smooths every boundary. Investigators mapped several such lines near the inlet, each leading away from roads and toward deeper swamp. Volunteers walked them and listened, hearing only the dry tap of branches and distant ice cracking. Reportedly, someone smelled wood smoke far off, but no campsite was located. Records conflict because that report was logged by a volunteer, not by an officer. On the 3rd day, Marco noticed broken twigs at waist height near a small rise, as if someone pushed through in a hurry. The marks led toward a hollow where wind had scoured the snow down to old crust. There, they found a torn snack wrapper and a piece of map paper, damp and folded hard. The map piece matched the corner of a regional trail guide sold in Ely stores. Investigators never confirmed Evan carried that guide, though Leah said he often bought maps last minute. As the week continued, the search shifted from rescue to recovery without anyone saying the words aloud. State records show resources were reduced after day 5, when weather forecasts warned of heavier snowfall. Leah stayed anyway, meeting each new group at dawn and handing out printed photos of Evan. Some locals claimed they saw a lone man near a beaver dam at dusk, but investigators never confirmed the sighting. Dispatch logs noted the tip, yet the location was miles from the last phone ping and hard to reach. The tipster later changed details, and the record includes both versions without resolution. There was talk of water because the inlet had spots of thin ice where current moved under the surface. Divers were requested, but conditions kept them out until the following weekend. When they arrived, they drilled holes and swept lines beneath the ice in careful grids. The divers reported no body and no gear, only weeds waving in the black water. Investigators noted that current can carry objects and that cold can preserve but also conceal. Records conflict because some volunteers believed a collapse would leave clear signs, while officials documented none. In 2019, a hiker found an old headlamp near a different trail, half buried in leaf litter and rusted snow. The finder reported it to the sheriff, and the county file added it as a possible lead. State records show the headlamp model matched one Evan might have owned, but ownership could not be proven. Its battery compartment was empty, and its strap was cut, not broken, which raised questions without answers. Investigators never confirmed whether the cut was from an animal, a tool, or years of friction. Leah returned to Duluth and kept working nights, but she called the sheriff's office every few months. Dispatch logs show polite updates, usually the same line about no new developments. Marco kept his own notes, sketched on receipts, and folded into his glove box. He reportedly visited the area each fall, walking the portage and scanning the ground for fabric or plastic. Some locals claimed he was obsessed, yet he told others it was routine, like checking a fence line after a storm. Records conflict because his visits were informal and rarely logged. In 2020, a controlled burn cleared a patch of undergrowth near the ridgeline. After the burn, a crew found a boot sole fragment and a metal belt buckle among ash and sand. The items were bagged and sent to the state lab, according to state records. The lab report said the buckle was common and the sole fragment lacked a serial imprint. Leah was told the items could not be linked to Evan, and the file remained open. Some locals claimed the buckle looked like Evan's, but investigators never confirmed it. The wrong trail, in this case, may not have been one path, but a chain of small decisions. A fork taken late, a map folded wrong, a shortcut toward open ice, a turn made to escape wind. Archived notes in the county file describe how snow can flatten landmarks until every direction feels familiar. Searchers noted that once a person loses the main corridor, they often keep moving to regain it, burning warmth fast. Dispatch logs show no further calls after that 13-second clip, and the phone was never recovered. State records list the case as missing, not deceased, because evidence never reached certainty. Years later, the Fernberg corridor still draws weekend hikers, and the junction still confuses newcomers in fresh snow. A small sign now warns about unmarked routes, installed after several incidents, though records conflict on which incident prompted it. Leah reportedly avoids winter trails now, choosing lakewalk sidewalks where lights are steady and exits are obvious. Marco still volunteers, still carries the same radio, and still pauses at that fork when calls come in. Investigators never confirmed what happened after Evan stepped off the blaze line, only that the forest kept the rest. Some locals claimed they know the answer, but the county file holds only fragments and silence.